The 40 Elephants, A True History of Women, Crime, and Survival. Written by Alana Sanchez, narrated by Vivienne. Copyright 2025 Alana Sanchez. All rights reserved. No part of this book may be reproduced, edited, copied, altered, printed, shared, stored on electronic devices, or distributed without written permission of the author. Preface. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, London's most feared and effective criminal organization was not led by men with guns or by shadowy figures in back rooms. It was led by women. They wore tailored coats. They walked through shop doors in broad daylight. They stole not in desperation, but with planning, discipline, and audacity. They were known, by police, shopkeepers, and the press, as the 40 Elephants. For decades, they moved through the city almost openly. They targeted the most fashionable department stores, the busiest streets, and the most expensive goods. They intimidated witnesses, evaded police, and returned again and again to courtrooms that seemed unable or unwilling to stop them. At their height, they were not a rumor or a curiosity, but a recognized criminal power. And yet, despite their notoriety, the 40 Elephants have never been fully told on their own terms. They appear in fragments, a newspaper headline mocking their femininity, a judge's condemnation, a police officer's frustration, a clerk's fearful testimony. They are rendered alternately as monsters, jokes, or moral lessons. Rarely are they examined as professionals. Almost never as products of their time. This book is a work of narrative true crime, grounded in documented events, court transcripts, arrest records, contemporary journalism, and police reporting. Every major incident described here occurred. Every named figure appeared in the historical record. The legal outcomes, dates, and locations are real. What cannot be recovered, private conversations, inner thoughts, unrecorded meetings, is treated with restraint. Where reconstruction is used, it is based on patterns established across multiple sources and is signposted by language rather than invention. No events are fabricated to heighten drama. The drama already exists in the record. This is not a celebration of theft, nor a redemption story. The 40 Elephants harmed people, shop workers who were threatened, intimidated, and sometimes assaulted, businesses that lost livelihoods, women whose lives were shaped, and often shortened, by cycles of arrest and imprisonment. None of that is minimized here. But neither is it simplified. The 40 Elephants matter not because they stole, but because of how they did it, and who they were allowed to be. They operated in a society that denied working-class women economic security, political power, and bodily autonomy. They were policed by institutions that underestimated them, punished them unevenly, and failed to imagine women as organizers of serious crime. They were reported on by a press obsessed with their clothes, their looks, and their perceived violations of femininity. In exploiting these blind spots, the 40 Elephants revealed something uncomfortable, that crime, like power, is shaped by social expectation. They were dangerous not only because they stole effectively, but because they refused the roles assigned to them. This book traces their story across nearly a century, from the crowded streets of Victorian London to the transformed retail world after the Second World War, not as legend, but as lived history. Many of the women who appear in these pages surface only briefly in the historical record. Some are known by aliases. Some vanish after a final sentence is passed. In many cases, silence is all that remains. That silence is not accidental. It reflects whose lives were considered worth recording, whose voices were preserved, and whose were lost. Where the record ends, this book does not pretend certainty, but it does refuse erasure. This is not a single biography, though at times it will follow singular figures closely. It is a collective history, shaped by continuity rather than chronology alone. Leadership changes. Tactics evolve. The city itself becomes a character, sometimes enabling, sometimes resisting. The story that follows does not begin with a crime, but with a window. Chapter 1. The window was designed to be looked at. Plate glass, polished until it disappeared, stretched from shoulder height to just above the pavement, creating the illusion that nothing stood between the passerby and the goods inside. Silk blouses draped like water over waxen mannequins. Gloves lay arranged in careful pairs, pale as bone. Hats tilted at angles, meant to suggest ease rather than cost. Everything was placed to imply abundance without effort, refinement without strain. The display promised that beauty was available, if one only stepped inside. On a weekday afternoon in late 19th century London, the pavement in front of such a window rarely stopped moving. Clerks on their lunch break, errand boys darting between adults, women with baskets and parcels, all flowed past in an unbroken current. Most did not slow. A few glanced. Fewer still allowed themselves to imagine what it might feel like to own what they were seeing. For the shop, the window was an invitation. For the city, it was a statement of confidence. For some women, it was something else entirely. Inside, the shop was quiet in the way money often is. The floorboards had been polished smooth by years of careful feet. Counters gleamed. Assistants stood alert but not anxious, trained to appear attentive without being intrusive. Their eyes followed customers politely, never lingering too long on any one figure, particularly if that figure looked respectable enough to deserve trust. The woman who paused in front of the gloves did not draw attention to herself. She was neatly dressed, her coat well cut but unremarkable, her boots scuffed just enough to suggest use rather than poverty. Nothing about her signaled urgency. When she reached for a pair of kid gloves, she did so with the casual entitlement of someone accustomed to touching such things. She turned them over, tested the leather between her fingers, and glanced briefly towards the counter as if calculating price rather than opportunity. No one noticed when the gloves failed to make it back to the display. The act itself took seconds. The gloves slid into the lining of her coat, disappearing into a pocket that had not been placed there by the manufacturer. Her hand emerged empty. She lingered just long enough to be convincing, then moved on, pausing at a rack of scarves she had no intention of touching. By the time she left the shop, the gloves were already beyond recovery. Outside, the street absorbed her without comment. This was not desperation. It was not hunger. It was not the frantic theft of someone driven by immediate need. It was deliberate, rehearsed, and efficient. It was also, by the standards of the time, largely invisible. Shoplifting was not new. Women had been accused of it for as long as shops had existed. But the scale and organization that would come to define the next several decades had not yet fully emerged. What existed instead were conditions, economic, social, and architectural, aligning in ways that made theft both possible and profitable for those willing to see the system differently. London at the end of the 19th century was a city built on display. Goods were no longer kept behind counters or locked away until purchase. They were laid out to entice. Department stores expanded rapidly, their success dependent on the assumption that customers could be trusted to move freely among the merchandise. That assumption rested on class, gender, and appearance. A woman who looked respectable was rarely suspected. A woman who knew how to look respectable could move almost anywhere. For working-class women, respectability was a performance with real consequences. Employment was insecure, wages were low, and options narrowed sharply with age, illness, or pregnancy. Many women worked from childhood until exhaustion made them expendable. Others moved in and out of service, factories, laundries, or informal labor, piecing together survival from whatever was available. Theft existed within this world not as an aberration, but as one of many strategies for managing uncertainty. What set the women who would later be known collectively apart was not merely that they stole, but that they learned to do it well. They observed shop layouts. They noticed which counters were busiest, which assistants were distracted, which exits were quickest. They adapted their clothing, commissioning coats with deeper linings, skirts with hidden folds, sleeves designed to conceal rather than decorate. They learned how to stand, how to browse, how to complain convincingly about prices they had no intention of paying. They learned when to work alone and when to move as a group. They also learned how to vanish. Arrest records from the period suggest a pattern that puzzled police at the time. The same names appeared again and again, often years apart, charged with similar offenses in different parts of the city. Addresses shifted. Aliases multiplied. Sentences were served, fines paid or converted into days in prison, and then the women returned, seemingly unchanged, to the streets and shops they knew so well. Punishment did little to disrupt the cycle. In some cases, it strengthened it. Prison, particularly for women, functioned as a meeting place. Skills were exchanged. Information traveled. The line between opportunistic theft and something more organized blurred. By the turn of the century, it was no longer unusual for shopkeepers to recognize certain faces, or for magistrates to comment on the frequency with which particular defendants appeared before them. Still, few imagined that these women were connected to one another in any meaningful way. The name would come later, attached first in whispers, then in print. At the beginning, there was only the work itself, the steady methodical taking of goods from places that assumed compliance and rewarded silence. There were no manifestos, no proclamations of intent. There was only the quiet confidence of women who understood that the rules governing access were not immutable, merely enforced. The window continued to do its job. Goods were displayed. Shoppers were invited. Trust was extended selectively, and exploited accordingly. Each successful theft reinforced the lesson that visibility could be a shield rather than a liability, that daylight was safer than darkness, and that the city's assumptions were among its most valuable resources. By the time shopkeepers began to speak openly of a problem, it was already well established. Losses were written off as inevitable. Staff were instructed to be vigilant, though rarely told how. Police took statements and made arrests, but struggled to articulate the nature of what they were facing. The idea that women, particularly working-class women, might be coordinating across neighborhoods, sharing techniques, and enforcing loyalty was not one the system was prepared to confront. Yet the evidence was there, accumulating quietly, much like the goods themselves. The woman who had taken the gloves did not hurry. She turned into a side street, then another, moving with the confidence of someone who knew exactly where she was going. Somewhere nearby, the gloves would be passed on, sold, or stored. Their value would be converted into rent, food, clothing, or cash. The transaction would leave no trace beyond an entry in a ledger marked shrinkage, and perhaps a brief suspicion that nothing could be done. The window, scrubbed clean at the end of the day, would reflect the street back at itself. Tomorrow it would display something else. And someone would be watching. Chapter 2. Respectability was not a quality one possessed. It was something that had to be performed, daily and without error. For working-class women in London, the margin for failure was narrow. A late payment, a missed shift, a rumor whispered to the wrong person, and respectability could slip beyond recovery. Employment rarely came with security. Wages were calculated to sustain labor, not lives. Illness, pregnancy, or age were not interruptions but disqualifications. To fall out of work was not unusual, to fall back in was never guaranteed. Most women learned this early. Childhood ended abruptly, often replaced by service, factory floors, or piecework done at home until fingers stiffened and eyes blurred. Domestic labor was poorly paid and easily withdrawn. Industrial labor paid little more and demanded more. Marriage, when it came, rarely offered relief. A husband's wages might stabilize a household, or they might vanish into drink, illness, or accident. Widows and deserted wives were common enough to be unremarkable. Within this landscape, morality was preached as discipline rather than protection. Women were told to be thrifty, patient, grateful. They were instructed to endure scarcity quietly, to see deprivation as a personal failure rather than a structural one. Charity was conditional and humiliating. Relief came with oversight. Independence, when it existed at all, was fragile. Against this backdrop, the shops glittered. Department stores were monuments to a different set of values. Abundance, choice, novelty. Goods were no longer rare objects acquired through necessity or inheritance, but commodities designed to be replaced, improved upon, desired anew. Fashion accelerated. What was acceptable one season became inadequate the next. The city encouraged longing while denying access. Women were at the center of this contradiction. They were the primary consumers in theory, the primary laborers in practice, and the primary targets of moral scrutiny in both. Their appearance was read as evidence of character. Cleanliness, neatness, and modest fashion signaled virtue. Shabbiness implied failure. Excess suggested impropriety. Every choice carried risk. Yet the same assumptions that constrained women also rendered them legible in ways that could be exploited. A woman who looked respectable was assumed to be harmless. Her presence in a shop was expected, even welcomed. She was there to browse, to choose, to deliberate. Her hesitation was read as discernment rather than calculation. Her touch was tolerated. Her questions indulged. If she lingered, it was because women were thought to be indecisive, not because they were assessing exits. Men, particularly working-class men, were watched more closely. Youths were monitored. The poorly dressed drew attention. Respectability functioned as camouflage. Some women learned to use it. They studied posture as carefully as any item for sale. They learned how to meet an assistant's eye without challenging it, how to complain just enough to appear entitled rather than suspicious, how to ask questions that required staff to turn away from counters and displays. They understood that politeness could be disarming, that irritation could be redirected, that offense taken at the right moment could end scrutiny altogether. They also understood that trust, once extended, could be moved through. Not all who stole did so with intent to repeat. Many were caught once and never returned. But others noticed patterns. They remembered which shops were lax, which assistants were inattentive, which days were busiest. They recognized one another, first vaguely, then with growing familiarity. A nod in passing. A shared glance when a counter was left unattended. Recognition without acknowledgement. The city was large, but its rhythms were predictable. Markets opened and closed. Trams followed set routes. Paydays fell on known dates. Shops prepared for sales and holidays with frantic displays and temporary staff. Opportunity clustered. Those who paid attention could anticipate it. It was in these repetitions that something more durable began to form. Court records from the period often describe women appearing alone, charged individually, sentenced individually. On paper, they were isolated offenders. In reality, many had learned from others long before they stood before a magistrate. Techniques traveled faster than names. A method that worked in one part of the city would appear weeks later in another. The same tailoring tricks surfaced across boroughs. Excuses, explanations, and defensive tactics repeated with uncanny consistency. Punishment, intended to deter, frequently had the opposite effect. Short prison sentences removed women temporarily from the streets but placed them in close quarters with others who shared experience, resentment, and practical knowledge. Inside, the distinctions that structured life outside blurred. Respectability had no currency there. What mattered was reputation, reliability, and skill. A woman who knew how to steal well, who knew how to keep silent, who could be trusted not to inform, was valuable. Information moved through conversation rather than instruction. Stories of arrests became lessons. Failures were dissected. Successes were admired. New contacts were made, addresses exchanged, alliances tested cautiously upon release. The prison gate did not end these relationships. It redistributed them. Outside, police struggled to interpret what they were seeing. Theft by women was treated as an individual moral lapse rather than organized crime. Magistrates scolded, lectured, occasionally expressed bafflement at repeat appearances. Shopkeepers complained, but losses were often absorbed as a cost of doing business. The idea that women might be coordinating, specializing, and enforcing internal discipline did not fit prevailing assumptions. That mismatch created space. Women who stole repeatedly learned not only how to take goods, but how to manage consequences. Fines were calculated into profits. Short sentences were endured as interruptions rather than endpoints. Some women arranged their lives around cycles of arrest and release, maintaining contacts on both sides of the prison walls. Others disappeared for years at a time, resurfacing when circumstances demanded. None of this required ideology. There were no speeches about injustice, no claims to righteousness. What existed instead was pragmatism. Theft worked. It paid better than legitimate labor. It offered flexibility. It rewarded intelligence and nerve. For women accustomed to being undervalued, it provided a rare sense of control. Still, control was never absolute. Violence hovered at the edges of this world, sometimes erupting, more often implied. Shop staff could be rough. Police could be cruel. Other thieves competed. Loyalty mattered because betrayal was costly. Silence mattered because exposure threatened everyone. These rules were not written down, but they were understood. By the early years of the 20th century, something like a culture had formed among certain women who moved in and out of shops, courts, and prisons with increasing familiarity. They shared language, habits, and expectations. They recognized one another even when names changed. They understood that discretion was survival, that confidence was armor, and that appearing ordinary was often the boldest strategy of all. The city continued to assume that what it was seeing were isolated acts, minor offenses, petty crimes committed by women who would eventually be corrected or disappear. It did not yet recognize the pattern taking shape beneath the surface, or the fact that these women were learning faster than the institutions meant to contain them. For now, there was only the steady accumulation of skill, knowledge, and mutual recognition. There was only the quiet understanding that the rules governing access could be bent without being broken, and that the very structures designed to enforce order could be navigated, and sometimes turned to advantage. The name had not yet been spoken aloud in court or print, but the groundwork for it was already laid, stitched into coat linings, memorized in shop aisles, and carried from cell to cell by women who had learned that respectability, once mastered, could be worn and removed at will. Chapter 3. The district that would lend the 40 elephants their name did not look powerful. Elephant and Castle sat south of the river, a knot of roads and rail lines that funneled people through rather than inviting them to stay. Trams rattled past at all hours. Markets spilled onto pavements already crowded with carts, children, and dogs. Lodging houses rose and fell with the tides of employment, their rooms filled by families one month and strangers the next. It was not a place associated with elegance or ambition. It was a place of movement, of passing through, of making do. For the women who lived there, or near enough to walk there daily, it offered something quietly valuable: anonymity without isolation. Elephant and Castle was not a slum in the way the press liked to imagine such places, but it was dense with people whose lives were precarious and whose movements were constant. Respectability existed here, but it was practical rather than aspirational. Neighbors noticed one another's habits more than their morals. A woman leaving early or returning late was unremarkable. Absence went largely unremarked unless it lasted too long. Privacy was rare, but scrutiny was shallow. This made the area useful. Women moved in and out of its streets on their way to work, to shops further north, to markets, to courts, to prisons and back again. It sat close enough to central London to be convenient, but far enough to escape some of its watchfulness. The transport links meant that a woman could appear in the West End in the morning and be home by afternoon without anyone questioning the journey. Rooms were rented by the week. Names changed easily. Addresses shifted. A woman might stay with family for a time, then with friends, then disappear altogether, leaving behind little more than an unpaid balance and a vague memory of her face. For those who lived by adaptability, this fluidity was an asset. It was also a meeting place. The women who would later be grouped together did not gather in formal assemblies or declare allegiance. They encountered one another in ordinary ways, on stairwells, in shared yards, at market stalls, outside public houses, in court corridors while waiting to be called. They recognized patterns of behavior long before they recognized intent. A woman who knew when to speak and when to keep silent. A woman who returned from prison with new clothes and no obvious means of having acquired them. A woman who disappeared after an arrest and reappeared months later without explanation. Conversation was cautious at first. Names were offered selectively. Trust was extended in increments. But proximity did its work. Information traveled. Warnings were passed along quietly, which shop assistants were vigilant, which detectives had begun to ask questions, which magistrates were particularly fond of making examples. What emerged was not an organization, but a shared understanding of how to move through the city with minimal friction. Elephant and Castle's proximity to courts and prisons mattered. The route between street, courtroom, and cell was short and well-worn. Women charged with theft often passed through the same spaces repeatedly, sometimes encountering the same faces under different circumstances. A woman seen in a dock one week might be spotted browsing a shop the next. The city was large, but its systems were repetitive. This repetition created familiarity. Familiarity bred recognition. Recognition, over time, bred obligation. If a woman vouched for another, that vouch carried weight. If someone broke silence or behaved recklessly, word traveled just as quickly. Reputation mattered because it was portable. A woman's standing followed her from street to shop to prison and back again. It was not written down, but it was remembered. Men moved through this world, but they did not dominate it. Some acted as fences, buyers of stolen goods, or occasional muscle. Others were family members or partners whose presence was peripheral rather than central. The core of this network was female, bound by shared experience and the practical realities of surviving in a city that offered them little margin for error. The geography of the district reinforced this cohesion. Streets curved and intersected unpredictably. Shortcuts were known to locals and invisible to outsiders. Public houses functioned as informal hubs, places where information could be exchanged without appearing to do so. Markets provided cover for meetings that looked accidental. Lodging houses created temporary communities that dissolved and reformed with ease. Police patrols existed, but they were stretched thin and often focused elsewhere. Elephant and Castle was busy enough to obscure individual movements, but not so notorious as to attract constant attention. When arrests were made, they were treated as isolated incidents, not symptoms of a broader pattern. This misreading was persistent. Authorities understood crime through categories that did not account for what was forming here. Organized crime was imagined as male, hierarchical, violent, and overt. What existed instead was informal, adaptive, and deliberately understated. It relied on shared knowledge rather than orders, on mutual interest rather than ideology. It did not announce itself. By the early 20th century, certain women were recognized within this loose network as particularly skilled. They were sought out quietly, asked for advice, deferred to in moments of uncertainty. Leadership was situational rather than absolute. Authority rested on competence and reliability, not titles. A woman who brought trouble was avoided. A woman who delivered results was remembered. This system allowed for growth without exposure. New women were incorporated gradually, taught by example rather than instruction. Mistakes were corrected privately when possible, punished socially when not. The emphasis was always on continuity. A failed theft was inconvenient. A broken relationship was dangerous. The district itself absorbed these dynamics without comment. Life went on. Children played in the streets. Markets opened and closed. Trams came and went. The women who moved through this world did so without spectacle, their activities indistinguishable from those of thousands of others trying to navigate the city's demands. Only later would the name attach itself, retrospectively imposing cohesion on what had initially been fluid. Only later would newspapers and police describe Elephant and Castle as a headquarters rather than a crossroads. At the time, it was simply a place that made sense, close enough to opportunity, distant enough from scrutiny, structured enough to support connection without drawing attention. The foundation was not laid by declaration, but by repetition. Women returned to the same streets, the same buildings, the same shops, until familiarity became infrastructure. They learned where to be seen and where to disappear. They learned how to exist in plain sight. By the time anyone thought to ask where these women came from, or how they seemed to know one another, the answer was already embedded in the geography itself. Elephant and Castle had not created them, but it had given them room to recognize one another, and to realize that survival did not have to be solitary. The city, as ever, mistook quiet for absence. Chapter 4. Skill was not innate. It was accumulated. No woman entered a shop already knowing how to steal well. What distinguished those who continued from those who were caught and disappeared from the record was not boldness, but attention. They watched how shops functioned, how staff moved, how customers behaved, and how the architecture itself shaped what was possible. Theft, at this level, was not an interruption of routine. It was embedded within it. The first lesson was always patience. Successful theft depended on blending into the rhythms of a shop rather than resisting them. Women learned to move at the pace expected of them, to browse with purpose but not urgency, to appear undecided without seeming lost. They learned that haste invited scrutiny, but so did lingering without reason. There was an ideal tempo, one that suggested leisure rather than calculation. They also learned where not to look. Direct attention to goods could be misread as desire or intent. Experienced women allowed their gaze to drift, to settle on assistants rather than objects, to register exits and counters without appearing to assess them. They knew that the eyes gave more away than the hands. Clothing was the second lesson, and perhaps the most important. The garments sold in the shops were not suited to theft as they were made. That work happened elsewhere, in rented rooms, back parlors, and shared yards. Coats were opened and re-sewn. Linings were loosened and deepened. Hidden pockets were added along seams, inside sleeves, beneath busts, and at the small of the back. Skirts were weighted and layered to conceal shape and movement. Buttons and fastenings were chosen for silence and speed rather than appearance. None of this was improvised. A poorly altered coat was as dangerous as an inattentive assistant. Weight distribution mattered. Balance mattered. A garment that pulled or shifted unnaturally would draw the eye. The best work was invisible not only to others, but to the wearer herself. It allowed her to move as she always had, to forget what she carried until it was safely elsewhere. Shoes mattered too. Soft soles over hard ones. Stability over fashion. A woman who stumbled betrayed herself. A woman who could move confidently while carrying weight was less likely to be questioned. Technique followed clothing. Different goods required different approaches. Small items like gloves, scarves, and hosiery were easiest, but they also attracted suspicion precisely because of their size. Larger items required coordination. Coats, dresses, and hats were taken when shops were busiest, when counters were crowded and staff stretched thin. One woman distracted. Another concealed. A third ensured a clear exit. Each role was interchangeable, but the sequence mattered. Hands were trained to work without looking. Fingers learned the feel of silk versus cotton, of tags versus seams. Women practiced at home, blindfolded or in low light, removing and replacing objects until the motion was automatic. The goal was not speed, but smoothness. An awkward movement was remembered. A natural one was forgotten. Voice was another tool. Women learned when to speak and when silence was safer. A polite question asked at the right moment could redirect attention entirely. Mild irritation could be weaponized, drawing an assistant into a defensive exchange that occupied both mind and body. Feigned confusion, especially from older women, created opportunities younger companions could exploit. Offense, once taken, was difficult to retract without embarrassment. Many assistants preferred to withdraw rather than escalate. They also learned how to leave. Exits were chosen before entry. Shops with multiple doors were preferred. Staircases provided cover. Lifts were risky and less crowded. Women rarely left immediately after taking goods, instead allowing time for suspicion to dissipate. Browsing continued. Purchases were sometimes made, not for necessity, but to anchor the appearance of legitimacy. A woman who paid for one item was less likely to be suspected of having taken another. Outside, routes varied. The shortest path was rarely the safest. Streets were chosen for their crowds, their noise, their capacity to absorb movement. A woman might double back, enter another shop, pause at a market stall, or board a tram not to travel, but to be seen traveling. The city itself was used as cover. Disposal was the final stage, and the most sensitive. Stolen goods were not kept longer than necessary. They attracted attention, required storage, and represented risk. Items were sold quickly, often through intermediaries who specialized in certain types of merchandise. Prices were understood to be fractions of retail value, but reliability mattered more than profit. A buyer who asked too many questions or failed to pay promptly was avoided. Some women sold directly at markets, blending stolen goods among legitimate wares. Others passed items along to fences who moved between districts. Trust was paramount. A single betrayal could unravel months of careful work. Mistakes happened. They were inevitable. When they did, the response was measured. A woman caught stealing alone bore the consequences alone, unless her arrest threatened others. Silence was expected, but it was also rewarded. Support might come in the form of money sent to prison, care for children left behind, or assistance upon release. These gestures were not altruistic. They reinforced loyalty and ensured continuity. Those who talked were not forgiven. Enforcement was rarely overt. Social exclusion was usually sufficient. Information dried up. Opportunities vanished. A woman who could no longer find work or allies was effectively removed from the network without spectacle. Violence, when it occurred, was a last resort and carried its own risks. What emerged from these practices was not merely a method of theft, but a shared discipline. Women learned to regulate one another through expectation rather than command. The standards were clear even when unspoken. Carelessness endangered everyone. Precision protected all. Police, when they began to notice patterns, struggled to articulate them. They described the thefts as skillful, daring, sometimes audacious, but rarely connected them to one another beyond coincidence. The absence of obvious hierarchy confused them. There were no written plans, no fixed headquarters, no leader issuing orders. What existed instead was a distributed intelligence, shared and refined through repetition. This adaptability made the practice resilient. When shops altered layouts, techniques shifted. When staff were trained differently, distractions evolved. When certain goods became too risky, attention moved elsewhere. The women who practiced this craft did not cling to tradition. They followed opportunity. By the time shopkeepers began installing mirrors, repositioning counters, and instructing assistants more explicitly, the methods had already moved on. The contest was asymmetrical. One side relied on rules and assumptions. The other relied on observation and adjustment. The women understood that perfection was unnecessary. What mattered was remaining just competent enough, just cautious enough, to continue. A single successful theft paid more than days of legitimate labor. A series of them could support a household. Over time, confidence grew, and with it, ambition. What had begun as individual acts now bore the marks of collective refinement. Techniques were shared, improved, and passed along. New women learned faster than those before them. Experience condensed into practice. Still, there was restraint. Excess invited attention. Greed endangered stability. The most successful women were those who knew when to stop, when to disappear for a while, when to let suspicion cool. Longevity was the measure of success, not notoriety. Yet notoriety was approaching, whether they sought it or not. As losses mounted and whispers circulated among shopkeepers, the idea that something coordinated was happening became harder to dismiss. Assistants compared notes. Managers instructed staff to watch for certain behaviors. Police began to pay closer attention to repeat offenders whose skills seemed to improve rather than decline. The craft that had kept these women invisible was becoming, paradoxically, what marked them out. They continued anyway, adjusting as they always had. The city was still full of windows, still full of assumptions, still willing to be deceived by appearances it had taught women to master. For now, the work remained quiet, precise, and effective. The name had not yet attached itself to the practice. But the practice was unmistakably there, refined to the point where theft was no longer an act of impulse, but a profession learned, taught, and sustained by women who understood that survival, in a city like London, rewarded those who paid attention. Chapter 5. Coordination did not arrive with a declaration. It arrived with repetition. By the time the century turned, certain women were no longer merely sharing methods, they were anticipating one another's presence. A familiar face at the edge of a counter no longer prompted caution, but adjustment. Movements synchronized without instruction. One woman's pause created space for another's hand. A question asked at the right moment redirected attention exactly where it needed to go. What had once been coincidence now carried intent. This did not yet resemble an organization. There were no meetings convened for the purpose of planning, no ledgers kept, no fixed chain of command. What existed instead was something looser and in many ways more effective, a network shaped by reliability. Women who proved competent were sought out again. Those who caused trouble were quietly avoided. Over time, patterns formed. Certain pairs appeared together more often than chance would allow. Certain trios moved with an ease that suggested rehearsal rather than luck. The city's size no longer concealed these repetitions from those inside them. Work began to be divided. Some women were better at distraction, comfortable speaking at length, adept at drawing assistants into conversation without raising suspicion. Others excelled at concealment, their hands steady and unremarkable, their bodies trained to carry weight without betraying it. Still others specialized in movement, knowing when and how to exit, which streets absorbed crowds most effectively, which trams provided cover rather than confinement. This division was not rigid. Everyone learned all aspects of the work. But preference mattered, and skill was respected. A woman who excelled at one role would be deferred to in that role, not because she demanded authority, but because ignoring competence was dangerous. Money followed the same logic. Early thefts had been solitary, their proceeds retained entirely by the individual. As coordination increased, so did the need to account for shared effort. Goods taken by more than one person required distribution. Disputes were rare, but not unheard of. When they occurred, they were resolved through reputation rather than force. A woman known to cheat would find herself without partners. A woman known to be fair would be invited back. Over time, informal standards emerged. Certain proportions were expected. Contributions were recognized. Support was extended to those arrested while working with others. These arrangements were understood rather than written, but they were enforced socially with surprising consistency. Trust, once established, extended beyond the shop floor. Women began sharing information about buyers, safe addresses, and storage. Not everything was disclosed at once. Sensitive knowledge was released gradually, contingent on behavior over time. A woman who proved discreet was entrusted with more. A woman who spoke too freely found herself excluded. This incremental disclosure created layers of access. Some women operated at the edges, participating occasionally, learning slowly. Others moved closer to the center, involved in planning routes, coordinating timing, and managing disposal. The structure remained flexible, but it was no longer accidental. Police attention, when it came, was uneven. Arrests continued, but prosecutions struggled to keep pace with what was changing. Women appeared before magistrates charged with individual offenses, their connections invisible in legal terms. Even when multiple defendants were charged together, the cases were framed narrowly, focused on the incident at hand rather than broader patterns. Conspiracy was difficult to prove. Coordination, when it left no paper trail, was harder still. This gap between practice and perception allowed the network to deepen. Women learned to stagger appearances, ensuring that not everyone involved in a particular operation was present in the same place at the same time. Arrests were absorbed. Roles shifted temporarily. Those not caught carried on. The work did not halt because a few were removed from circulation. It adapted. Prison continued to function as both risk and resource. Women arrested together were cautious inside, aware that association could be used against them later. But those arrested separately still encountered familiar faces. News traveled. Adjustments were discussed obliquely. Release dates were noted. Plans were reconfigured accordingly. What distinguished this phase from earlier ones was intention. The women involved were no longer merely responding to opportunity as it arose. They were selecting targets. Certain shops were favored for their layouts, their staffing practices, their tolerance for loss. Certain days were preferred. Sales periods, holidays, and busy afternoons offered cover. Quiet mornings were avoided. The city's commercial calendar became part of the calculation. They also began to test limits. Smaller items gave way to larger ones. Single shops gave way to sequences. A woman might enter one shop, take nothing, move on to another, then return later to the first when staff had relaxed. Coordination across shops required timing and restraint. Mistakes were more costly. Success was more lucrative. With increased scale came increased risk. Shop staff began to talk among themselves. Descriptions were exchanged. Behavioral cues were noted. Some women found themselves watched more closely than before. This did not end their work, but it required adjustment. Appearances changed. Hairstyles altered. Weight gained or lost intentionally. Names shifted. Familiarity was managed rather than avoided. Within the network, experience began to stratify. Older women, or those with longer histories, carried authority simply by having survived. They had seen techniques fail and succeed. They remembered which mistakes led to arrest and which did not. Younger women watched them closely, learning not only what to do, but what to avoid. Instruction remained implicit, but the hierarchy of attention was clear. This authority was not absolute. It could be challenged by competence. A younger woman who demonstrated exceptional skill could rise quickly, earning deference through performance rather than age. The system rewarded results, not seniority alone. Violence remained peripheral, but its potential was understood. Intimidation of shop staff was rare, used sparingly and strategically. A threat carried weight only if it was credible, and credibility depended on restraint. Excessive aggression invited police attention and hardened resistance. The most effective deterrence was reputation. A shop known to have challenged certain women too openly might find itself targeted repeatedly. Others learned to look away. By now, the work had become something closer to an occupation than an opportunistic sideline. Women planned around it. Lives were structured to accommodate it. Periods of activity alternated with periods of withdrawal. Children were cared for. Rent was paid. Clothing was replaced. The proceeds were not extravagant, but they were reliable. Still, there was caution. Not every woman involved was known to every other. Connections were maintained selectively. This compartmentalization limited damage when arrests occurred. It also prevented any single figure from becoming indispensable. Leadership existed, but it was diffuse, situational, and often temporary. From the outside, little appeared to have changed. The shops still glittered. The windows still invited. Customers still browsed. Arrests still occurred sporadically, reported as curiosities or moral lessons rather than symptoms of a larger phenomenon. The city continued to assume that what it was seeing were individual women making poor choices, not a collective refining a profession. Inside the network, however, there was an emerging awareness that they were no longer alone in their work. They were part of something that extended beyond any one person, any one shop, any one arrest. The continuity of practice, the shared standards, and the mutual recognition had created a structure resilient enough to persist. It did not yet have a name, but it had a shape. That shape would soon attract attention, not because it announced itself, but because it endured. In a city accustomed to churn and disappearance, longevity was conspicuous. The same women returned. The same losses mounted. The same frustrations were voiced by shopkeepers and police alike. What had begun as shared technique was becoming shared identity, even if it remained unspoken. The women involved understood that they were operating within a system of their own making, one that demanded discipline and rewarded competence. The city, as ever, was slow to understand what was happening in front of it. When it did, the language it reached for would be inadequate, sensational, and revealing. But for now, the work continued quietly, coordinated enough to be effective, restrained enough to remain largely unseen. The line between individual theft and collective enterprise had been crossed, not with ceremony, but with confidence. Chapter 6. The courtroom was not designed to explain. It was designed to conclude. Women charged with theft stood before magistrates in rooms that prized efficiency over inquiry. Names were called. Charges read. Evidence summarized. Decisions made. The pace left little room for nuance, and none for context. What mattered was the act, not the pattern. A woman's history might be noted, her manner commented upon, but the broader shape of her life remained irrelevant to the outcome. For the women who returned repeatedly, this predictability was not a disadvantage. They learned the rhythms of the court as they had learned the rhythms of shops. They knew when to speak and when silence carried more weight. They understood which explanations irritated magistrates and which elicited impatience rather than suspicion. They recognized the value of contrition when it shortened proceedings, and the cost of defiance when it prolonged them. Some cultivated meekness. Others leaned into irritation. A few displayed humor, carefully measured, to suggest foolishness rather than intent. These performances were not spontaneous. They were refined through observation, discussed quietly in holding cells and prison corridors, adjusted after each appearance. Sentences varied. Fines were common, often beyond the means of those expected to pay them. Default meant days or weeks in prison. Short custodial sentences were frequent, long enough to disrupt life but rarely long enough to deter. For women accustomed to instability, prison became another environment to navigate rather than an endpoint. Inside, the world contracted. Women entered through gates that stripped them of possessions, names replaced by numbers, clothing exchanged for uniforms that erased distinction. The first days were the hardest. Routine imposed itself quickly. Work, meals, sleep, all regulated by bells and orders. Privacy was minimal. Observation was constant. And yet, within this confinement, something unexpected occurred. Women who might never have spoken on the street found themselves sharing space, labor, and time. Differences of neighborhood, age, and reputation blurred. What remained were shared experiences: arrest, trial, punishment. Stories circulated. Some were exaggerated, others deliberately incomplete. But patterns emerged nonetheless. Prison was where techniques were compared openly, if cautiously. It was where women learned which methods had failed and why, which judges were particularly severe, which shops had begun to change their practices. It was where reputations solidified. A woman who kept silent under questioning was noted. A woman who panicked or talked too freely was remembered. Silence was not merely moral, it was practical. Those who maintained it found support. Small kindnesses circulated: extra food, shared tasks, protection from petty cruelty. These gestures were not sentimental. They were investments. A woman who behaved reliably inside was likely to behave reliably outside. Prison compressed time in a way the street did not. Trust could be tested quickly. Release did not sever these connections. Women left prison with addresses written on scraps of paper, memorized names, and promises made without ceremony. Some would reconnect immediately. Others waited months or years. The bond did not require constant contact. It rested on recognition and mutual interest. Courts reinforced this continuity inadvertently. Magistrates frequently remarked on repeat offenders, sometimes with frustration, sometimes with resignation. Their comments, recorded in newspapers, contributed to a public narrative of incorrigibility that obscured the practical realities of what was happening. Women were framed as morally deficient rather than strategically engaged. This framing justified repetition. If punishment was failing, the fault lay with the individual, not the system. For the women themselves, repetition normalized the experience. Arrest became a risk to be managed, not a catastrophe. Court appearances were anticipated, prepared for, discussed afterward. The legal system, intended to disrupt, instead became a predictable feature of the landscape. Prison also taught hierarchy. Not all women were equal inside. Those with longer histories, or those known to have managed more complex thefts, commanded attention. Others deferred, listened, learned. Leadership emerged through competence and composure rather than force. A woman who remained calm under pressure was valued. A woman who could navigate both staff and inmates without conflict earned respect. Violence existed, but it was not constant. More often, control was exercised through inclusion and exclusion. Access to information, companionship, and support was granted or withdrawn based on behavior. This social economy proved remarkably effective. Authorities noticed fragments of this but failed to connect them. Prison officers recorded associations. Police noted shared addresses and repeated names. But these details remained siloed, scattered across files and jurisdictions. Without a framework to interpret them, they were dismissed as coincidence or inevitability. Meanwhile, the women involved refined their approach. They learned how to enter prison without attracting attention and how to leave without carrying grudges. They learned which staff were strict, which could be reasoned with, which ignored small infractions. They learned how to endure confinement without burning bridges. The boundary between inside and outside grew porous. A woman arrested might pass along information before sentencing, ensuring adjustments were made on the street. Others took over roles temporarily, maintaining continuity. The work did not cease because someone was imprisoned. It redistributed. Children were looked after. Rent was covered when possible. Not always, and not generously, but often enough to reinforce loyalty. These arrangements were informal, flexible, and contingent. They were also effective. Over time, the cumulative effect of these interactions was consolidation. What had been a loose network gained density. Relationships layered upon one another, strengthened by shared risk and shared consequence. Women who had met only once or twice before now recognized one another as part of the same world. The sense of operating alone diminished. The courts continued to treat each case in isolation. Prisons continued to process women individually. In doing so, they provided the very conditions that allowed collective identity to deepen. By the time shopkeepers and police began to speak of a persistent problem rather than isolated incidents, the women involved had already internalized a different understanding. They were not merely offenders recurring by chance. They were participants in an ongoing practice, sustained through cycles of arrest and release. This did not make them invincible. It did not erase fear or hardship. Prison remained harsh. Courts remained unpredictable. Lives were still disrupted, sometimes permanently. But the collective knowledge accumulated through these systems mitigated some of the damage. Survival improved. Longevity increased. The city had built institutions to contain disorder. In doing so, it had unintentionally provided spaces where skill, trust, and coordination could be refined. The women who passed through those spaces learned to use them as thoroughly as they had learned to use shops and streets. What emerged was not rebellion, nor solidarity born of ideology. It was a practical alliance shaped by repetition and reinforced by necessity. Courts and prisons, meant to isolate, had instead become points of connection. The work continued, more resilient now, better informed, and increasingly difficult to dismiss as coincidence. The women involved did not yet name themselves. They did not need to. They knew who they were. Chapter 7. The newspapers did not discover the women all at once. They circled them. At first, the coverage was incidental, buried among police notices and court summaries, written in the flat language of routine. A woman charged with shoplifting. A sentence passed. A brief remark from the bench. These items appeared daily, interchangeable with dozens of others, notable only for their frequency. The same types of offenses. The same names returning after intervals that suggested neither reform nor disappearance. Editors noticed patterns before readers did. By the early years of the 20th century, theft by women had become a dependable source of copy. It carried novelty without risk. It could be framed as moral instruction, as comedy, or as warning, depending on the paper's audience. Respectable women stealing silk and lace offered titillation without sympathy. Working-class women doing the same could be rendered ridiculous or monstrous with equal ease. The language hardened quickly. Women accused of theft were described as brazen, bold, shameless. Their clothing was noted with particular interest, as though fabric itself were evidence of guilt. A well-cut coat suggested deception. Jewelry implied ill-gotten gains. Even neatness was suspect. The implication was clear. A woman who appeared respectable but behaved criminally was doubly offensive. Court reporters lingered on manner. They recorded how women stood, how they spoke, whether they smiled or wept. A lack of visible remorse was criticized. Too much emotion was dismissed as performance. There was no correct response. Whatever a woman did could be interpreted as proof of her unfitness. This attention did not discourage repetition. It altered it. Women learned to read what was written about them, or had it read aloud. They recognized the power of description. A name printed often enough became recognizable beyond its immediate context. Some women changed aliases more frequently. Others leaned into notoriety, understanding that familiarity could intimidate shop staff and witnesses more effectively than anonymity. The press, in turn, learned what sold. Stories that hinted at organization attracted more interest than isolated incidents. Reports began to draw connections, cautiously at first. Phrases like known to the police and an old offender became common. Journalists speculated about associations, about women who appeared together, about repeated appearances in different courts. The idea that these thefts might be linked was floated, then retracted, then floated again. What the press could not see clearly, it embellished. Women were cast as ringleaders or followers based on little more than confidence of demeanor. Age became authority. Physical presence was mistaken for dominance. A woman who spoke sharply to police was imagined as commanding others. The narrative demanded hierarchy, and so hierarchy was supplied. This distorted reality, but it also changed it. Attention brought pressure. Shopkeepers became more vigilant. Assistants were instructed to remember faces described in print. Police were encouraged to look for connections they might previously have ignored. The margin for error narrowed. Inside the network, this scrutiny forced adjustment. Women discussed coverage obliquely, aware that overt reaction could draw further attention. Some reduced activity. Others shifted districts. A few took advantage of the confusion, exploiting heightened fear to deter staff from confrontation. Reputation, once local and informal, now traveled further and faster. The press also provided a strange form of validation. To see one's name in print was not always unwelcome. It confirmed significance. It suggested that what had once been dismissed as petty was now recognized as persistent. For women accustomed to invisibility, this recognition carried weight, even when hostile. Yet it was a double-edged acknowledgement. Sensationalism stripped complexity. Motive was reduced to moral failing. Skill became audacity. Coordination was reframed as threat. The women themselves were flattened into types: the hardened thief, the sly accomplice, the shameless recidivist. Individual differences disappeared beneath the label. As reporting intensified, a collective identity began to coalesce externally before it did internally. Journalists sought names for what they perceived. They reached for language that suggested exoticism and menace, borrowing from familiar tropes. Animal imagery was popular. The women were described as predatory, cunning, organized. Their gender was emphasized at every turn, as though criminality required explanation when paired with femininity. The effect was cumulative. Readers came to expect stories about women thieves. Shoplifting ceased to be surprising. What shocked instead was scale and persistence. When articles suggested that thefts were coordinated across shops or districts, alarm sharpened. The idea that women might be working together, deliberately and effectively, unsettled assumptions about crime and control. Police felt this pressure acutely. Questions were asked in public forums. Why were these women not deterred? Why did sentences not work? Why did the same figures return? Officers were encouraged to produce results, to demonstrate that authority remained intact. Surveillance increased. Informants were sought, though rarely found. Evidence was assembled with growing frustration. Inside the courts, magistrates adopted harsher tones. Remarks grew more scathing. Sentences lengthened incrementally. Examples were made. These measures satisfied headlines but achieved little else. The underlying structure remained intact, insulated by its informality and adaptability. The press did not recognize this. It mistook visibility for vulnerability. Women who had once operated quietly now had to contend with reputation preceding them. This changed recruitment. Newer participants were drawn not only by opportunity, but by notoriety. The idea of belonging to something feared and discussed carried appeal, particularly for those whose legitimate options were few. At the same time, risk increased. The margin for misstep narrowed further. A woman whose face was recognized too widely became a liability. Decisions about inclusion and exclusion grew sharper. The network, once diffuse, began to harden in response to external definition. Ironically, the press provided the language that would eventually name what it was describing. Before that name settled, it circulated in variations, some quickly discarded, others repeated. Each attempt imposed coherence where practice remained flexible. The women themselves did not correct these narratives. Silence allowed exaggeration to flourish, and exaggeration served as deterrence. The relationship between press and practice became symbiotic. Coverage heightened fear. Fear reduced resistance. Reduced resistance enabled continued theft. Continued theft generated more coverage. The cycle fed itself, largely independent of the women's intentions. What the newspapers failed to grasp was that attention did not dismantle the network. It reshaped it. The women adapted, as they always had, absorbing scrutiny into their calculations. They learned which papers exaggerated most wildly, which details were unreliable, which descriptions could be ignored. The city read about them over breakfast and forgot them by evening. The women involved did not have that luxury. Every word printed altered the environment they worked within. By the time the press began speaking confidently of a group rather than individuals, the transformation was complete. What had once been continuity recognized only internally was now spectacle, visible and named from the outside. The women had not chosen this exposure, but they would live with its consequences. From this point on, anonymity would be harder to recover. Reputation would precede action. The work would continue, but under a new condition, visibility imposed by others, interpreted through lenses that alternated between fascination and condemnation. The story was no longer just theirs to control. And the city, having finally noticed them, would not look away again. Chapter 8. The police did not suddenly decide to take the women seriously. They were compelled to. Complaints from shopkeepers had been routine for years, filed, acknowledged, and largely absorbed as the cost of doing business in a city built on consumption. What changed was tone. Losses were no longer dismissed as petty or inevitable. They were described as systematic, repeated, embarrassing. Merchants began to frame the problem not as theft, but as failure of deterrence, failure of enforcement, failure of authority. That framing mattered. Police forces were sensitive to public perception, particularly when it suggested impotence. Newspapers had begun to imply that women were exploiting gaps in surveillance and prosecution with impunity. Magistrates complained of seeing the same defendants too often. Shop owners demanded visible action. The pressure converged. In response, attention sharpened. Plainclothes officers were assigned to busy shopping districts with instructions to observe rather than intervene immediately. Notes were taken. Faces memorized. Movements tracked loosely rather than continuously. The intention was not yet to dismantle a network. Few were willing to admit such a thing existed, but to understand why certain women seemed so difficult to catch in the act. This observational phase was uncomfortable for everyone involved. Officers accustomed to clear offenses and straightforward arrests found themselves watching behavior that was suggestive rather than actionable. A woman browsing too intently. A conversation that lasted too long. A hand that moved quickly and then stilled. None of it, on its own, justified intervention. Acting too early risked embarrassment. Acting too late meant loss. Women noticed the change quickly. They were accustomed to surveillance, but this was different. The watchers lingered. They returned day after day. Their presence was subtle but consistent. A familiar face near the entrance. A man who pretended to browse without buying. Attention that followed movement rather than appearance. Inside the network, adjustments were made. Certain shops were avoided temporarily. Roles were redistributed. Women with less recognizable faces took on greater responsibility. Those whose names had appeared most frequently in print withdrew or altered their routines. The work did not stop, it shifted. Police struggled to keep pace with these adaptations. Information sharing between districts was inconsistent. Records were kept locally, filed by name rather than method. Aliases complicated matters. Addresses changed frequently. A woman arrested in one borough might reappear months later in another with no obvious link. Without centralized systems, patterns remained fragmented. When arrests did occur, they often disappointed. Officers who believed they were close to something larger found themselves bringing isolated cases to court. Evidence of coordination dissolved under scrutiny. Witnesses recanted or refused to testify. Shop staff, intimidated or exhausted, offered minimal cooperation. Cases collapsed or resulted in minor sentences that did little to justify the effort expended. This frustration fed a growing sense that the women were mocking authority. That perception was dangerous. It encouraged riskier policing strategies. Officers began stopping women on suspicion rather than evidence. Confrontations escalated. Mistakes were made. Wrong women were challenged. Complaints followed. Public sympathy, when it appeared, was unpredictable and often fleeting. The women exploited this tension carefully. They understood that excessive aggression from police could provoke backlash. A woman wrongfully accused, especially if she appeared respectable, could attract sympathy in court and press. Some learned to use this to their advantage, cultivating indignation as a shield. Others avoided confrontation entirely, melting away at the first sign of scrutiny. The contest became psychological as much as practical. Police attempted to intimidate through presence. Women responded by dispersing. Officers targeted individuals. The network compensated by rotating roles. Each move prompted a countermove, rarely decisive, always exhausting. Behind the scenes, more ambitious efforts were discussed. Some officers advocated for coordinated surveillance across districts, for sharing information about repeat offenders more systematically. Others argued that resources were better spent elsewhere. Theft by women, no matter how persistent, still ranked below violent crime in priority. The idea that these women represented an organized threat worthy of sustained attention remained contentious. Meanwhile, the courts continued to process cases individually. Even when police suspected coordination, proving it was another matter entirely. The legal threshold for conspiracy was high. Shared presence was not enough. Similar methods were not evidence. Without informants or documentation, cases stalled. The women's very informality protected them. Prison, again, played its part. Women arrested during this period returned inside with fresh information about police tactics. They shared what they had seen, where officers stood, how they followed, which shops cooperated most readily. This intelligence was fed back into practice upon release. The learning cycle tightened. The police were aware, in abstract terms, that prisons facilitated these exchanges. They lacked the means to prevent them. Segregation was impractical. Monitoring conversations was limited. The system assumed isolation where there was continuity. Public frustration mounted. Newspaper editorials demanded firmer action. Shopkeepers lobbied for harsher penalties. Magistrates delivered increasingly stern lectures from the bench. Yet the outcomes remained stubbornly familiar. Arrests rose modestly. Convictions fluctuated. The same names reappeared. What no one could quite articulate was that enforcement alone was insufficient because the problem was not merely behavioral. It was structural. The women were not exploiting a loophole that could be closed. They were exploiting assumptions embedded in the city's social and commercial life. Police attention, however intense, could not eliminate that advantage. By this stage, the women involved were fully aware that they were being watched as a group, even if the authorities could not yet define the group clearly. This awareness altered behavior subtly but decisively. Decisions were made with longevity in mind. Risk was calculated collectively. Exposure was managed strategically. Visibility had become a condition of operation rather than a threat to be avoided. The police, for their part, began to suspect that something more cohesive existed beneath the surface, something that could not be dismantled through conventional means. They lacked the language, the tools, and the institutional imagination to address it directly. What they did have was persistence. Surveillance would intensify. Arrests would become more targeted. Individual women would be singled out as exemplars, their punishment amplified in the hope of deterrence. These efforts would shape the next phase of the story, narrowing possibilities while hardening resolve. The balance between concealment and recognition was shifting. The women could no longer rely solely on invisibility. The police could no longer pretend the problem was incidental. Both sides were now engaged in a sustained, if uneven, contest over control of space, movement, and attention. The city, watching from shop windows and newspaper columns, sensed that something was coming to a head. What form it would take remained uncertain. But the era of quiet accommodation was ending. Chapter 9. War did not interrupt the city so much as loosen it. When fighting began overseas, London did not stop moving, but its attention fractured. Men left. Routines broke. Shortages emerged unevenly, affecting some neighborhoods and industries before others. Authority remained, but it was stretched thinner, redistributed across priorities that had little to do with shop floors and fitting rooms. For the women who already understood how to work within instability, this shift was not disorienting. It was familiar. Shops continued to trade, though staffing changed quickly. Experienced assistants enlisted or were redirected to war work. Replacements arrived with minimal training, uncertain authority, and little institutional memory. Managers focused on supply rather than loss. Policing, already inconsistent, was redirected towards matters deemed more urgent. Theft did not disappear from notice, but it receded in importance. Crowds changed shape. Uniforms appeared everywhere. Women moved through the city in greater numbers and with greater independence, filling roles vacated by men. The sight of women traveling alone, working long hours, or moving between districts ceased to attract comment. Anonymity expanded with necessity. The women who had been refining their practice for years recognized the shift immediately. Busy shops were busier still. Confusion provided cover. New staff hesitated to challenge customers, uncertain of procedure and wary of mistakes. Supervisors were distracted. Displays were rearranged frequently as supply fluctuated. Familiar layouts dissolved and reformed. What might have unsettled others offered opportunity to those accustomed to adjustment. Clothing, too, changed. Utility replaced ornament in public rhetoric, but demand for quality remained. Scarcity elevated value. Goods that once moved slowly now disappeared quickly. Theft adapted accordingly. Smaller quantities yielded greater returns. Risk could be managed more efficiently. Inside the network, the war accelerated changes already underway. Women who might previously have hesitated to join now found legitimate work no more secure than illicit income. Wages lagged behind prices. Dependence increased. The distinction between necessity and opportunity blurred further. Recruitment, such as it was, occurred through proximity and example rather than invitation. New women watched, learned, and began to participate. Coordination deepened under pressure. With arrests less predictable and resources stretched, the cost of mistakes increased. Women became more selective about who worked with whom. Trust, already central, hardened into expectation. Behavior that might once have been corrected quietly now carried sharper consequences. The margin for carelessness narrowed. Prison sentences continued, but their impact shifted. Short terms were endured with resignation. Longer ones loomed as real threats, particularly as wartime rhetoric encouraged harsher punishment for perceived disorder. Women calculated risk with greater care, balancing immediate need against longer-term survival. Some withdrew temporarily. Others adjusted roles, favoring planning and coordination over direct action. Information became more valuable. News of staff changes, policing patterns, and supply fluctuations circulated quickly. Women who worked legitimately during the day passed observations back into the network. Shops that struggled with shortages became targets not only for goods, but for predictability. Desperation at the retail level created complacency. Police attention waxed and waned. Periods of intense focus were followed by long stretches of relative neglect. Officers rotated assignments. Institutional memory suffered. Women who had been closely watched one month found themselves ignored the next. The inconsistency rewarded patience. The press, absorbed by war reporting, offered less sustained scrutiny. Stories of theft still appeared, but they were smaller, less sensational, crowded out by casualty lists and military developments. This absence of spectacle reduced pressure. Visibility diminished just enough to allow work to continue without attracting renewed moral panic. Yet war also introduced new risks. Heightened suspicion accompanied scarcity. Accusations of hoarding and profiteering sharpened tempers. Confrontations escalated more quickly. Shop staff, under stress, sometimes reacted aggressively. Violence, long peripheral, crept closer to the center of interactions. The women responded with restraint. They avoided escalation wherever possible, understanding that wartime discipline could justify harsh responses. Intimidation was used sparingly, threats delivered obliquely rather than overtly. Reputation remained effective, but discretion mattered more than ever. Children grew older during these years. Some became aware of their mother's activities without understanding their scope. Others were shielded carefully. Domestic arrangements shifted repeatedly as circumstances demanded. The work supported households, but it also destabilized them. Absences were explained. Questions were deflected. Normality was performed as convincingly at home as it was in shops. By the later years of the war, the network bore little resemblance to its earlier incarnation. It was larger, though not necessarily broader. Participation was deeper, expectations clearer. The shared understanding forged through years of adaptation had been stress-tested and reinforced. Those who remained were there by choice and competence rather than chance. The end of the war did not arrive cleanly. Demobilization brought men back into shops, into policing, into oversight roles that had lapsed. Routines reasserted themselves unevenly. Assumptions shifted again. What had been tolerated as disruption during wartime became suspect in peace. The women noticed the change as quickly as they had noticed the war's beginning. They adjusted once more, withdrawing from some spaces, advancing into others. Techniques refined under pressure proved resilient. Coordination honed during scarcity translated effectively into the emerging consumer landscape. What the war had done, more than anything, was prove durability. The women had not merely survived disruption, they had used it. They had learned that instability, far from undermining their work, often enhanced it. They had learned to operate amid uncertainty without losing cohesion. As the city attempted to return to order, it carried with it habits formed under strain. Some of those habits would persist, reshaping commerce, policing, and social life. Others would fade. The women who had learned to work within flux were not inclined to abandon their advantage simply because peace had been declared. The next phase would bring new challenges, new visibility, and new figures who would embody the reputation that had been forming for decades. The city was about to meet them in a different way. Chapter 10. The war had altered what women could do. Peace tested whether they would be allowed to keep it. When men returned, they did not return to the same city they had left. Shops had changed. Streets moved differently. Women occupied spaces that had once been provisional and were now simply familiar. They traveled alone without comment. They handled money. They made decisions. The temporary had lasted long enough to feel permanent. That permanence unsettled people. There was a quiet insistence, voiced in editorials and sermons rather than laws, that things should return to normal. Women were encouraged to step back, to relinquish roles they had filled competently. Employment contracted unevenly. Some were dismissed outright. Others found wages cut, hours reduced, responsibilities stripped away. The promise of stability dissolved quickly. For women who had built parallel lives during the war, this retraction confirmed what experience had already taught them. Security was conditional, and it could be revoked without warning. The work resumed with renewed clarity. Shops expanded again, eager to capitalize on post-war demand. Fashion surged forward after years of restriction. Materials once scarce returned in abundance, displayed with deliberate excess. Windows grew more elaborate. Consumption was framed as recovery, as reward for endurance. The city invited desire loudly and persistently. The women who moved through this landscape understood the invitation differently. They were no longer testing themselves against a system they barely understood. They knew its rhythms intimately. They recognized the gaps between intention and execution, between policy and practice. They understood that visibility had limits, and that respectability, once mastered, could still be worn convincingly. What had changed was scale. The network that had survived the war did not disperse with peace. It adapted to it. Women who had gained confidence during years of disruption did not retreat quietly. They expected continuity. They expected to earn. They expected to move freely. Theft was no longer merely supplemental for many of them. It was integral. Coordination became more deliberate. Operations were planned with greater care, drawing on lessons learned during scarcity. Risk was managed collectively. Women were rotated through roles to reduce recognition. Districts were alternated. Periods of intense activity were followed by deliberate withdrawal. The work was paced. The police noticed an increase not just in theft, but in competence. Arrests were harder to secure. Evidence was thinner. Women challenged authority more confidently, not with aggression, but with composure. They knew their rights well enough to exploit ambiguity. They understood procedure well enough to stall it. This confidence irritated officers accustomed to deference. Confrontations sharpened. Surveillance intensified again. But the women had learned to expect this. They absorbed pressure without fracturing, redistributing risk as needed. A woman who drew attention stepped back temporarily. Others took her place. Continuity was preserved. The press returned its gaze. With the war over, space reopened for moral commentary. Stories of women thieves resurfaced, framed now as evidence of social decay rather than wartime necessity. The tone shifted from indulgent curiosity to anxiety. Women who refused to relinquish autonomy were increasingly portrayed as threats to order. Names appeared more frequently. Some women became recognizable figures in court reports, their repeat appearances noted with a mix of fascination and condemnation. Their confidence was read as defiance. Their skill was reframed as menace. The idea that these women represented something organized, something deliberate, gained traction. Inside the network, this attention prompted recalibration rather than retreat. Women discussed exposure with a frankness born of experience. They understood that reputation could protect as well as endanger. A woman known to be formidable was less likely to be challenged by shop staff. A woman recognized by police was more carefully watched, but also more cautiously approached. Balance mattered. Violence remained rare, but intimidation became more explicit. A look held a moment too long. A quiet word delivered close enough to be felt rather than heard. These gestures were calculated, restrained, and effective. They signaled consequence without inviting escalation. The women also began to test expansion beyond London. Rail networks made movement easier. Shops in other cities offered similar layouts and similar assumptions without the burden of local recognition. Small groups traveled briefly, worked intensively, and returned. Successes were shared. Failures were analyzed. The possibility of scale widened. This mobility further complicated policing. Local forces struggled to connect incidents across jurisdictions. Information lagged. Coordination between districts remained inconsistent. The women exploited these seams carefully, never lingering long enough to attract sustained attention. At home, lives continued alongside the work. Children grew. Relationships formed and dissolved. Some women attempted legitimate employment intermittently, drawn by the promise of stability. only to abandon it when wages proved inadequate or conditions intolerable. Others relied entirely on theft, structuring their lives around its rhythms. None of this was romantic. The work was tiring, the risk constant, the consequences real. Prison loomed as ever. But for many, the alternative was worse. Dependence offered no security. Respectability, when it failed completely. What the post-war period made clear was that the women involved no longer saw their actions as temporary deviations. They had built a system that functioned. It rewarded attention, discipline, and nerve. It allowed for adaptation. It offered continuity in a world that rarely did. The city, attempting to reassert old boundaries, found them harder to enforce. Women moved through spaces they had learned to occupy and were reluctant to abandon. Authority asserted itself, but not decisively. Each attempt to restore order exposed how much had already shifted. The network, shaped by years of adjustment, was no longer reactive. It was anticipatory. It understood that pressure would increase, that visibility would sharpen, that individual figures would soon be singled out as embodiments of the problem. It did not yet know which women those would be, but it understood the pattern well enough to prepare. The era of anonymity was narrowing. What came next would require stronger personalities, clearer lines, and leadership that could withstand attention without collapsing under it. The city was moving towards confrontation, even if it did not yet recognize it as such. And the women, having learned to endure withdrawal and expansion alike, were not inclined to step aside. Chapter 11. Growth did not announce itself as ambition. It arrived as necessity. The women who had endured the war and the unsettled peace that followed found themselves operating in a city that no longer tolerated improvisation. Attention was sharper. The press more alert. Police more inclined to connect patterns, even when they struggled to prove them. Survival now depended less on individual cleverness than on collective reliability. That reliability required numbers. Not many, and not all at once, but enough to distribute risk and maintain continuity. Women who had once worked alone or in pairs began to operate in slightly larger constellations. Roles were assigned more consistently. Distinctions between those who planned, those who executed, and those who disposed of goods grew clearer. Recruitment remained cautious. New women were not invited so much as observed. They were watched over time, how they spoke, how they moved, how they reacted to pressure. A woman who asked too many questions too quickly was avoided. One who noticed things without comment was noted in return. Entry into the work happened gradually, often without explicit acknowledgement. A first distraction. A shared exit. A test passed quietly. Those who proved careless were dropped without explanation. This selectivity shaped the character of the group. The women who remained were not necessarily the boldest or most desperate, but the most adaptable. They understood restraint. They valued patience. They accepted instruction without demanding authority. Ego was a liability. As numbers increased, discipline tightened. Mistakes that might once have been tolerated now carried sharper consequences. A woman who acted independently at the wrong moment endangered others. That behavior was corrected quickly, sometimes with words, sometimes with exclusion. The message was clear: autonomy was conditional on competence. Leadership began to solidify, though it remained fluid. Certain women emerged as organizers not because they sought control, but because others deferred to them instinctively. They remembered routes, timings, and contingencies. They understood when to withdraw and when to press advantage. They had survived enough arrests to know what could be endured and what could not. Their authority was practical rather than symbolic. They did not issue commands so much as shape decisions. Suggestions were followed because they worked. Warnings were heeded because they proved accurate. This authority could shift. A woman who faltered lost influence. One who delivered gained it. The hierarchy was real, but it was earned repeatedly. Expansion also meant reach. The women no longer confined themselves to familiar streets or habitual shops. They mapped the city with greater intention, identifying clusters of opportunity and rotating through them. Suburbs with new shopping districts offered anonymity. Seasonal sales created predictable surges. Travel was planned to coincide with these rhythms. Short trips beyond London became more common. Groups moved briefly through other cities, working intensively before returning. These excursions were carefully limited. Lingering invited attention. Success depended on speed and discretion. What was learned on these trips fed back into practice at home, expanding the collective understanding of how retail spaces functioned across contexts. This mobility complicated relationships with buyers. Fences who had once dealt with individuals now found themselves negotiating with intermediaries. Volumes increased. Reliability became essential. A buyer who failed to pay promptly or attempted to renegotiate terms was replaced. The women could afford to be selective. Their goods moved quickly. Money circulated differently as a result. Proceeds were divided with greater formality, though still without records. Expectations were understood. Support for those arrested while working with others became more consistent. These arrangements reinforced loyalty and reduced panic. A woman who knew she would not be abandoned was less likely to talk. The police sensed the shift without fully understanding it. Arrests yielded fewer results. Surveillance uncovered fragments rather than networks. Individual women appeared competent, calm, and uncooperative. The lack of visible leadership frustrated efforts to dismantle what was increasingly acknowledged, privately if not publicly, as an organized problem. Pressure increased. Plainclothes officers lingered longer. Shops installed more preventative measures. Assistants were trained to challenge politely but persistently. These changes forced further adaptation. The women adjusted timing, spacing, and selection. They accepted lower yields in exchange for reduced risk. Longevity remained the priority. Inside the group, the emotional cost of this work became more apparent. Tension accumulated. Trust required maintenance. Disputes over money or responsibility surfaced occasionally, usually resolved through mediation by those with standing. Violence remained rare, but the potential for it underpinned interactions. Everyone understood the stakes. Some women withdrew during this period. Age, exhaustion, family obligations, or fear prompted departures. These exits were managed quietly. No one was forced to stay. But those who left did so knowing that return was not guaranteed. The work demanded presence and reliability. Absence eroded both. For those who remained, identity shifted. They no longer saw themselves as individuals occasionally cooperating. They were part of something sustained, something recognizable to insiders even if it remained indistinct to outsiders. They shared language, habits, and expectations. They understood that their actions reflected on one another. This collective awareness altered behavior subtly. Recklessness diminished. Displays of bravado were discouraged. The work became more efficient, less theatrical. Success was measured by continuity rather than conquest. Each theft was a means to an end, not an end in itself. Yet expansion carried its own risks. More women meant more exposure. More movement meant more chance of recognition. More success attracted attention. The balance between growth and concealment grew delicate. The group navigated this balance by narrowing its core. Not everyone who participated was equally trusted. Layers formed. Some women worked only at the edges, performing limited roles. Others occupied the center, privy to more information and greater responsibility. This stratification protected the whole by limiting the damage any one arrest could cause. By this stage, the transformation was unmistakable. What had begun as shared technique had become coordinated practice. What had been informal had acquired structure. What had relied on anonymity now managed reputation deliberately. The women involved did not use the language of organizations, but they behaved as one. The city, slow to adapt, continued to chase individuals while missing the shape of the whole. The press searched for names and faces to personify the problem. Police searched for leaders to remove. Neither approach captured the reality unfolding beneath them. That reality would soon crystallize around figures capable of carrying attention without collapsing under it. The groundwork had been laid. The network had expanded, disciplined itself, and learned to move deliberately through increasing scrutiny. The next phase would test whether it could survive the weight of recognition that was coming, and whether those at its center were prepared to bear it. Chapter 12. She did not arrive as a legend. She arrived as a presence. In a world that prized restraint, she was immediately noticeable, not because she flaunted herself, but because she did not soften her edges. She stood squarely. She met eyes without apology. She moved through shops and streets with the assurance of someone accustomed to being seen and untroubled by it. Where others cultivated invisibility, she accepted recognition and learned to manage it. Her name was Alice Diamond, though for some time it meant little beyond a line in a charge sheet or a remark in a court summary. She was not the first skilled woman to emerge from this world, nor the only one capable of command. What distinguished her was not novelty, but concentration. Attention, which had been diffused across many women for decades, began to settle around her. Alice was physically imposing by the standards of the time, taller than many of the men she encountered, broad-shouldered, confident in her body. She dressed deliberately. Tailored coats emphasized structure rather than softness. Rings flashed when she moved her hands, heavy enough to be felt if not always seen. Nothing about her suggested hesitation. In shops, assistants learned quickly that challenging her carried risk. Not necessarily of immediate violence, but of confrontation that would not end in embarrassment for her. She did not retreat under scrutiny. She did not fluster. She responded to suspicion with controlled irritation, the kind that suggested offense rather than fear. Many chose to disengage rather than escalate. Within the network, her emergence altered dynamics subtly but decisively. She did not invent new methods. She inherited them, mastered them, and enforced their use with unusual consistency. Women who worked with her noticed that mistakes were addressed directly. Carelessness was not indulged. Discretion was assumed. Those who met these expectations found working with her profitable and predictable. Those who did not were excluded. Her authority did not depend on affection. She was not widely liked, but she was respected. That distinction mattered. In a world where trust was currency, reliability trumped warmth. Alice delivered results. She protected those who worked competently. She punished betrayal swiftly and visibly enough to deter repetition. Violence, when it occurred, was controlled. Accounts differ, exaggerated by the press and muted by those who lived through it, but there was little doubt that Alice was willing to use force when she deemed it necessary. This willingness did not make violence commonplace. It made it credible. The threat of it carried weight precisely because it was not constant. Her rise coincided with a moment when the network required consolidation. Expansion had reached a point where diffuse leadership risked fragmentation. Increased police attention demanded coordination that could withstand pressure. Alice provided a focal point for decision-making, a figure around whom others could align without formal declaration. This alignment was pragmatic rather than ideological. Women worked with Alice because it made sense to do so. Operations under her influence were disciplined. Proceeds were distributed according to expectation. Support during arrest or imprisonment was reliable. Her reputation extended beyond those who worked directly with her, shaping behavior across the network. Police began to notice. Her name appeared more frequently in reports. Her presence at scenes of theft was remarked upon. Descriptions circulated. Officers spoke of her with a mix of frustration and wary respect. She was not easily intimidated. She did not crumble under questioning. She understood the limits of what could be proven and operated within those limits deliberately. The press, always alert to personality, seized on her quickly. They described her appearance in detail, lingering on her clothing, her rings, her demeanor. She was framed as a curiosity at first, then as a menace. The language sharpened. Nicknames emerged, designed to make her both exotic and legible. She was cast as a leader, a queen, a figure of command. This narrative simplified reality, but it also reshaped it. Attention concentrated on Alice in ways it had not on others before her. This made her both asset and liability. Her presence could deter interference. Her visibility could draw surveillance. The balance between these effects required careful management. Inside the network, adjustments followed. Alice did not work constantly. She appeared selectively, choosing moments where her presence mattered most. Others operated in her absence, guided by standards she enforced rather than instructions she issued. This distribution of labor protected her from overexposure while extending her influence. Women who worked under her influence adopted aspects of her style. Not the rings or the posture, but the discipline. Operations became tighter. Errors less frequent. Intimidation, when used, was calibrated. The work took on a sharper edge, less forgiving of improvisation. This did not erase internal tension. Alice's authority was not uncontested. Other capable women existed, some with longer histories, some with broader networks. Alliances shifted. Cooperation coexisted with rivalry. The network did not become monolithic. It remained layered and adaptive. What changed was perception. From the outside, the story began to look simpler. A group needed a leader. A leader had been found. This satisfied journalistic logic and police expectation. It allowed attention to focus, strategies to be designed, and blame to be allocated. From the inside, Alice was less a monarch than a fulcrum. She bore the weight of attention that might otherwise have dispersed. She absorbed pressure that might have fractured others. Her presence allowed the network to continue operating under heightened scrutiny by giving police and press a figure to fixate on. This was not altruism. It was strategy. Alice understood, perhaps instinctively, that visibility could be managed as carefully as concealment. She accepted notoriety because she knew how to live with it. She adjusted her movements, her associations, her timing. She did not disappear. She repositioned. As her reputation grew, so did the stakes. Mistakes involving her carried greater consequences. Arrests attracted more coverage. Sentences threatened to lengthen. The margin for error narrowed further. Alice responded by tightening control, insisting on adherence to standards that had once been flexible. This rigidity alienated some and stabilized others. Those unwilling to submit withdrew. Those who remained did so knowingly. The network, already stratified, developed a clearer center around her. It was not yet permanent. It was not uncontested. But it was unmistakable. The city, watching from its windows and newspapers, began to believe it had found the face of the problem. In doing so, it underestimated the system that had produced her. Alice Diamond did not create the network. She inherited it at a moment when inheritance mattered. She did not invent its methods. She enforced them with uncommon clarity. She did not stand alone. She stood where attention had gathered. What followed would test whether that concentration could endure. For Alice, for the women who worked with her, and for the city that had finally decided to look closely, the next phase would be sharper, louder, and far less forgiving. The era of quiet consolidation was over. Chapter 13. Power in this world was not abstract. It was felt. It lived in the way decisions were made without discussion, in the silence that followed a warning, in the certainty that consequences would arrive if expectations were ignored. Under Alice Diamond's influence, the network did not become louder or more visible. It became sharper. Margins narrowed. Behavior that had once been tolerated as idiosyncratic was corrected or removed. The first thing that changed was tone. Where coordination had once relied on suggestion and example, it now carried insistence. Instructions were still rarely phrased as commands, but refusal was no longer an option. A woman who hesitated, who questioned timing or method too openly, marked herself as unreliable. That unreliability did not provoke argument. It provoked exclusion. This discipline was not enforced universally or constantly. It appeared selectively, at moments when stakes were highest. Alice did not involve herself in every operation. She appeared when her presence would stabilize, intimidate, or decide. In her absence, the standards she set continued to shape behavior. Those standards were exacting. Timing mattered. Arriving early or late disrupted coordination. Appearance mattered. Clothing was expected to be functional, inconspicuous, and suited to role. Deviation invited scrutiny from within as much as from outside. Silence mattered. Loose talk was not indulged, even in private. A woman who spoke carelessly endangered others. The rings Alice wore were not merely ornament. They were noticed because she allowed them to be noticed. Heavy enough to bruise, they served as quiet reminders that her authority was physical as well as social. She did not brandish them. She did not need to. Their presence was understood. Shop staff who recognized her understood that confrontation could escalate quickly. Other women understood that defiance would not be ignored. Violence, when it occurred, was brief and decisive. Accounts from the period, filtered through newspapers and court testimony, vary wildly in detail. Some are clearly exaggerated. Others are conspicuously restrained. What emerges consistently is not frequency, but certainty. Alice was known to act, and that knowledge shaped behavior far more effectively than constant force ever could. Inside the network, fear was balanced carefully with reward. Women who worked competently under Alice's influence benefited from stability. Operations ran smoothly. Proceeds were distributed predictably. Support during arrest or imprisonment was reliable. Children were looked after when possible. This consistency fostered loyalty, not because of affection, but because alternatives were worse. Those who crossed her did not remain. Exclusion could be swift. Information dried up. Opportunities vanished. In a world where survival depended on access, this was punishment enough. In rare cases, confrontation escalated beyond that. Word traveled quickly, discouraging imitation. Alice's leadership also changed how intimidation was used externally. Threats became more deliberate, less reactive. A shop that challenged too openly might receive a visit later, not immediately, when memory had dulled but recognition remained. A staff member who attempted to intervene aggressively might be confronted away from the shop floor, where witnesses were fewer and embarrassment greater. These encounters were calculated. The aim was not injury, but deterrence. Violence was a tool, not an indulgence. Its effectiveness lay in restraint. Shops that learned this lesson often chose avoidance over enforcement. Losses were absorbed quietly rather than risk escalation. Police pressure intensified in response. Alice's name appeared with increasing frequency in reports. Officers tracked her movements where possible, noting associations and patterns. Surveillance focused on her presence as an indicator of heightened risk. Yet this attention also limited police options. Acting too aggressively risked public confrontation and legal missteps. Acting too cautiously allowed operations to continue. Alice exploited this tension. She learned where she could appear safely and where absence served better. She varied routines. She delegated. Her visibility was managed deliberately, appearing where intimidation mattered, withdrawing where exposure outweighed benefit. This required trust in others. Women working under her influence were expected to uphold standards without supervision. Failure reflected not only on them, but on her. This shared risk reinforced discipline. Those unable to meet it were removed from central roles. Not everyone accepted this arrangement. Some women resented Alice's dominance, particularly those who had operated independently or held influence previously. Rivalries flared, usually contained, occasionally disruptive. The network did not fracture, but it did not unify completely either. Power remained contested at the margins. Alice navigated these tensions pragmatically. She did not seek to eliminate rivals entirely. Cooperation, even uneasy, was often preferable to conflict. Boundaries were negotiated implicitly. Overlap was managed. The aim was continuity, not conquest. The press, observing from the outside, simplified these dynamics relentlessly. Alice was cast as the singular leader, the embodiment of female criminality. This narrative ignored the depth and resilience of the system beneath her, but it served a purpose. It concentrated blame. It offered a face for fear. It allowed complex behavior to be reduced to personality. Alice understood this reduction instinctively. She did not attempt to correct it. Allowing herself to be seen as central diverted attention from others. It gave police a figure to pursue, and the network space to operate around that pursuit. Her prominence became a shield as much as a risk. Yet that shield was not impermeable. Each arrest carried greater weight. Each court appearance attracted more attention. Sentences threatened to lengthen. The stakes rose steadily. Alice responded by tightening control further, insisting on precision that left little room for error. The cost of this precision was exhaustion. Working under constant scrutiny required vigilance that could not be sustained indefinitely. Tension accumulated. Trust had to be maintained actively. Any lapse could cascade. The system held, but it strained. What distinguished this period was not just Alice's authority, but the clarity it imposed. The network knew what it was under her influence, disciplined, feared, and increasingly visible. It also knew what it risked becoming, brittle under pressure, overexposed, vulnerable to collapse if mismanaged. Alice carried this awareness without sentiment. She did not speak publicly of legacy or future. Her decisions were immediate, tactical, grounded in survival rather than ambition. She managed power as she managed theft, deliberately, efficiently, without illusion. The city, watching her closely now, mistook control for inevitability. It assumed that identifying a leader meant approaching resolution. It believed that pressure applied to a single figure could dismantle what had taken decades to form. That belief would soon be tested. For Alice, and for those aligned with her, the coming years would demand not only discipline, but endurance. Attention would sharpen. Consequences would escalate. The balance between intimidation and exposure would grow ever more precarious. The system she had inherited had carried many women through uncertainty. Whether it could carry this degree of focus remained an open question. What was certain was that Alice Diamond had become more than a participant. She was now the measure against which the city defined the problem. And the city was preparing to answer it. Chapter 14. A successful operation did not begin in a shop. It began days earlier, sometimes weeks, in conversation that sounded like reminiscence rather than planning. Women spoke about shops they had visited recently, about new displays, about staff who had changed. These exchanges were casual, scattered through ordinary interactions, difficult to distinguish from gossip. Nothing was written down. Nothing was agreed upon explicitly. By the time an operation took shape, it felt less like a decision than a convergence. The choice of shop mattered, but not in the way outsiders imagined. Luxury alone was not enough. A shop had to offer movement, multiple counters, multiple entrances, enough space to allow bodies to circulate without colliding. Staff needed to be busy, but not alert. The ideal shop was confident rather than careful, convinced of its own orderliness. Timing mattered more. Mid-afternoon was often preferred. Lunchtime crowds were unpredictable, surging and thinning without rhythm. Early mornings carried too much scrutiny. Late afternoons brought fatigue that could sharpen suspicion rather than dull it. The hours when attention softened without collapsing were best. On the day itself, the women arrived separately. They did not walk together. They did not acknowledge one another upon entry. Each approached the shop as if alone, their movements unremarkable, their expressions neutral. The appearance of coincidence was essential. A group was suspicious, a series of individuals was not. Roles emerged without announcement. One woman positioned herself near a counter that required assistance, selecting items slowly, asking questions that required the assistant to turn away from the floor. Another drifted towards a display that encouraged handling, folded garments, stacked scarves, hats arranged close enough to brush against one another. A third hovered near an exit, browsing lightly, attuned to shifts in atmosphere. No one rushed. The work depended on patience, on allowing the shop to relax around them. They waited for the moment when attention fractured just enough. A new customer entering. A question shouted from another counter. A register opening. These small interruptions created pockets of absence, brief but sufficient. The act itself was precise. Hands moved without hesitation. Items were lifted, folded, slid into prepared spaces that accepted them without resistance. No fumbling. No adjustment. The body absorbed the change in weight smoothly. To an observer, nothing appeared to happen at all. Once concealed, the item ceased to exist. The woman continued browsing. She replaced an item on the counter. She asked another question. She waited. Leaving immediately would suggest cause. Staying too long would invite scrutiny. The exit was timed to appear coincidental, prompted by boredom rather than success. Outside, separation resumed. Routes diverged immediately. One woman turned towards a tram stop she did not intend to use. Another entered a neighboring shop and browsed briefly, empty-handed. A third walked several streets before altering direction. The goal was dispersion. The city's density was not relied upon blindly, it was activated deliberately. If something went wrong, response was swift but restrained. A glance held a moment too long. An assistant stepping closer than expected. A hand brushing fabric at the wrong angle. These signals were read instantly. The item was abandoned if necessary. Loss was preferable to arrest. Pride had no place here. If an assistant challenged, the response was measured. Surprise rather than fear. Offense rather than guilt. The aim was to reverse the dynamic, to make the challenge itself seem improper. A woman who appeared wronged could destabilize staff confidence quickly. Escalation was avoided unless unavoidable. Argument was a tool, not an impulse. In rare cases, confrontation escalated. When it did, it was decisive. A word spoken too quietly to be overheard. A look held long enough to unsettle. Physicality, if used, was brief and targeted, designed to shock rather than injure. The goal was escape, not dominance. Prolonged conflict invited attention that could not be controlled. If arrest occurred, contingency plans activated immediately. The woman arrested was treated as lost to the operation. Others continued without alteration. Leaving together would invite suspicion. Each exit was managed independently. The work did not halt because one had fallen out of circulation. It adjusted. Support followed later. Money was raised to cover fines if possible. Messages were passed discreetly. Children were checked on. These actions reinforced expectation. A woman who endured consequences without talking was not abandoned. Silence was reciprocated with assistance. What distinguished operations under Alice's influence was not innovation, but consistency. She insisted on restraint even when success tempted excess. One item taken cleanly was preferable to two taken greedily. A shop that yielded profit quietly could be returned to later. A shop pushed too hard would close itself off. Longevity required discipline. Her presence, when included, altered the atmosphere. Assistants recognized her quickly. Tension sharpened. Some withdrew rather than engage. Others watched her closely, ignoring those around her. This focus created opportunity elsewhere. Alice rarely took items herself in such moments. She did not need to. Her value lay in attention diversion and deterrence. Police surveillance complicated matters. Plainclothes officers occasionally appeared where they were not expected. Their presence was detected not through uniforms, but through behaviour. Men who lingered without purpose, eyes tracking movement too carefully, bodies positioned to block exit subtly. When identified, plans shifted instantly. The operation dissolved without incident. Nothing was taken. Everyone left. Failure was absorbed without drama. The women understood that success was cumulative, not episodic. One abandoned attempt meant little in the long view. Arrests and attention mattered more than lost goods. This patience distinguished them from imitators, who often pressed too hard and paid for it quickly. Afterwards, the operation was discussed indirectly. What had gone well? What had felt off? Which staff members had noticed more than expected? These conversations were quiet, embedded in ordinary interactions, stripped of detail that could incriminate. Learning was continuous, but never formalized. The effect of this discipline was cumulative. Shops found it difficult to pinpoint why losses continued. Staff felt watched without being able to articulate by whom. Managers adjusted layouts and procedures, often too late or in the wrong direction. Each response generated new gaps. The women moved through these changes with professional detachment. They did not celebrate success openly. There was no exhilaration to be shared. Satisfaction lay in continuity, in the ability to return home without incident, to pay rent, to feed children, to plan the next day. Theft was labor. Risk was overhead. What the city failed to grasp was how ordinary this had become. Operations like this unfolded repeatedly, across years, across shops, across districts. Each one refined the practice slightly, reinforced expectation, and deepened collective knowledge. The drama existed largely in hindsight, imposed by courts and newspapers that encountered only fragments. For the women involved, it was routine. That routine, sustained under increasing scrutiny, was what made the system formidable. It did not rely on brilliance or daring. It relied on repetition, discipline, and the refusal to be hurried by either opportunity or fear. As long as those conditions held, the work would continue. And as long as the work continued, the city would struggle to understand how something so quiet could be so persistent. Chapter 15. Fear did not enter the shops loudly. It arrived in fragments. A glance that lingered a second too long. A voice lowered rather than raised. A memory shared between assistants at the end of a shift, difficult to explain and easier to dismiss. No single incident was decisive. Together, they accumulated into something harder to ignore. Shop staff learned fear before management did. They were the ones on the floor, negotiating between courtesy and vigilance, expected to protect stock without provoking customers. Training was uneven. Instructions contradicted themselves. Be attentive, but not accusatory. Intervene, but avoid confrontation. The burden of judgment fell on individuals least equipped to carry it. When things went wrong, the consequences were personal. An assistant who challenged the wrong customer risked reprimand or dismissal. One who failed to prevent theft risked the same. Losses were tallied, but responsibility was diffuse. Fear settled into this uncertainty, not as panic, but as tension held in the body. Women like Alice Diamond amplified that tension without overt action. Her reputation traveled ahead of her. Assistants recognized her from descriptions, from whispers passed along during breaks, from warnings delivered quietly by supervisors who could not offer solutions. When she entered a shop, the atmosphere shifted subtly. Conversations faltered. Movements slowed. Attention narrowed. This narrowing created opportunity. Staff who focused too intently on Alice often missed what happened around them. Others, unsure whether to intervene, chose inaction. The risk of confrontation with someone known to retaliate, however infrequently, outweighed the abstract obligation to protect goods. Fear functioned as a deterrent to resistance. It was reinforced selectively. A shop that attempted to bar entry or call police openly might receive a visit later, not necessarily from Alice herself, but from someone acting under the same understanding. These encounters were rarely violent, but they were unmistakable. A word spoken privately. A presence felt too close. A reminder that the shop floor was not the only place where power could be exercised. The effectiveness lay in ambiguity. Nothing that could be easily reported occurred. There were no clear threats to quote, no injuries to document. What remained was unease. Staff spoke to one another rather than to police. Managers absorbed losses rather than escalate. Fear settled into routine. Not all shops responded the same way. Some attempted resistance. They installed mirrors, repositioned counters, trained staff to intervene more assertively. These measures worked briefly, then faltered. Fear adapted. Challenges were met with calm offense rather than aggression. Assistants were made to feel rude, intrusive, outmatched. Others chose avoidance. They instructed staff not to engage. Losses were written off. The calculation was pragmatic. Insurance existed. Confrontation carried unpredictable cost. Better to let goods go than to invite trouble. This acquiescence did not require explicit agreement. It emerged from experience, reinforced by stories shared across shops and districts. Fear traveled laterally, not through formal channels. One assistant's unease became another's caution. Over time, a shared understanding developed. Some women were not worth the risk. Police presence complicated this dynamic without resolving it. Officers encouraged staff to report incidents, to stand firm, to assist prosecution. They could not guarantee protection. Responses were slow. Outcomes uncertain. Assistants who testified risked recognition later. Fear extended beyond the shop floor into streets and neighborhoods. Women exploited this extension carefully. They did not threaten families or homes overtly. Such escalation would have provoked decisive response. Instead, they allowed the possibility of recognition to do the work. A face remembered on the street. A coincidence at a tram stop. Nothing provable. Everything suggestive. Inside the network, fear was managed deliberately. Excessive intimidation was discouraged. A shop cowed too completely attracted attention. Balance mattered. Fear was to be sufficient, not spectacular. It functioned best when it remained indistinct, when no single act could be isolated as cause. Alice enforced this balance rigorously. She understood that fear was most effective when paired with predictability. Violence that appeared random or excessive destabilized relationships and invited retaliation. Controlled intimidation preserved space for operation. Her reputation allowed her to exert pressure with minimal action. Others learned to do the same. The emotional cost of this strategy was uneven. Some women were comfortable operating within fear, seeing it as an extension of risk already accepted. Others found it corrosive, eroding boundaries they preferred to maintain. These differences shaped participation. Women who hesitated withdrew. Those who remained adapted. Shop staff adapted too. They learned to read cues, to recognize when engagement was futile. They developed informal strategies, pairing up near exits, rotating duties, signaling one another quietly. These measures offered reassurance more than protection. Fear remained. The press, when it touched on these dynamics at all, misread them. It focused on violence rather than its absence, on dramatic confrontations rather than the quiet decisions that preceded them. It described terror where there was tension, menace where there was calculation. This sensationalism obscured the mundane reality of fear as an operational tool. For the women involved, fear was neither moral nor immoral. It was functional. It reduced resistance. It shortened encounters. It shifted decision-making away from confrontation. It allowed operations to proceed with fewer interruptions. It was one element among many, used sparingly and with intent. The system did not depend on fear alone. It depended on the willingness of shops to absorb loss, of staff to avoid escalation, of police to struggle with proof. Fear nudged these tendencies in a favorable direction. It did not create them. As fear spread unevenly across districts, the women adjusted. Shops known to resist were avoided temporarily. Those that acquiesced quietly were revisited. Patterns emerged. Losses concentrated. Management noticed, but often too late to intervene effectively. By this stage, the dynamic had inverted. Shops feared certain customers more than customers feared being caught. This inversion was subtle, fragile, and constantly contested, but it existed. It shaped behavior on both sides of the counter. Alice understood this inversion better than most. She did not seek to deepen it indefinitely. Excessive fear invited backlash. Her aim was equilibrium, a state where resistance was low enough to allow continuity, but not so low as to provoke decisive intervention. Maintaining this balance required constant attention. As police pressure increased and press narratives hardened, the space for subtlety narrowed. Fear risked becoming spectacle, and spectacle was dangerous. The system held, but it grew more brittle. What had once been diffuse unease now clustered around specific figures and stories. Alice's name carried weight beyond its practical utility. Fear attached to it, magnified by repetition. The city was no longer merely uneasy. It was beginning to feel challenged. And challenge, unlike unease, demanded response. The next phase would test whether fear could continue to function as quietly as it had, or whether it would tip into something louder, costlier, and far harder to control. Chapter 16. The state did not move quickly. It moved deliberately, and too late. By the time police leadership began speaking openly about the need for coordinated response, the problem had already hardened beyond simple remedy. Theft by women was no longer understood as a series of isolated failures, but as a persistent challenge to authority that had survived years of incremental enforcement. The language shifted. What had been described as nuisance was now framed as threat. That reframing carried consequences. Meetings were held. Files were pulled and compared. Officers who had worked shopping districts for years were asked to recall names, faces, habits. Patterns were sketched imperfectly, assembled from memory rather than system. The absence of centralized records hampered everything. Knowledge lived in individuals, not institutions. Still, an effort was made. Surveillance intensified in specific areas rather than broadly. Known figures were watched more closely. Plainclothes officers were instructed to follow rather than intervene, to observe patterns rather than chase incidents. The aim was accumulation of evidence, enough to justify more serious charges. This approach demanded patience the system was not well equipped to sustain. Watching without acting frustrated officers trained to intervene. Watching women walk away repeatedly with goods they could not yet prove were stolen strained discipline. The temptation to act prematurely was constant, and sometimes indulged. When it was, cases collapsed. Women noticed these changes immediately. They sensed attention not through direct confrontation, but through persistence. The same faces appeared too often. Routes felt watched. The city's texture shifted subtly, pressure replacing fluidity. Inside the network, response was swift. Operations were reduced in frequency and increased in precision. Women rotated roles more aggressively. Those under close observation withdrew entirely. Newer participants were kept at the edges. The work slowed, but it did not stop. Police frustration grew. Attempts to cultivate informants failed repeatedly. Women arrested refused cooperation with remarkable consistency. Threats carried little weight when sentences were already familiar. Offers of leniency were met with silence or suspicion. The system could not identify leverage that mattered. The courts offered limited assistance. Even when police believed they were close to demonstrating coordination, legal thresholds intervened. Conspiracy charges required evidence of agreement. Shared presence was insufficient. Similar methods were coincidence. Without written plans or testimony, cases reverted to individual offenses. Magistrates expressed irritation, but remained bound by law. Some responded by increasing sentences, hoping severity might succeed where frequency had failed. Others warned defendants publicly, creating theater without deterrence. The effect was uneven. Longer sentences removed some women from circulation temporarily, but did not dismantle the system that absorbed their absence. Prison continued to redistribute rather than disrupt. Women returned inside carrying fresh intelligence about police tactics. They shared what they had observed, who followed, how closely, where pressure concentrated. This information flowed back out upon release, tightening the feedback loop between enforcement and adaptation. The state escalated again. Certain women were designated as priorities, their movements tracked more persistently. Surveillance shifted from shops to streets, from theft to association. Officers waited for moments when multiple known figures appeared together, hoping to establish connection. The women responded by avoiding precisely those configurations. Meetings were spaced. Interactions shortened. Familiarity was managed carefully. The network contracted inward, sacrificing efficiency to preserve insulation. This contraction frustrated police further, producing fewer observable links rather than more. The press intensified pressure from another direction. Editorials demanded decisive action. The language of menace hardened. Female criminality was framed as moral collapse rather than practical problem. Calls for example-making grew louder. Police leadership felt compelled to demonstrate resolve. Arrests followed that impulse. High-profile figures were targeted when opportunity arose, even when evidence was thin. These arrests generated headlines but rarely convictions commensurate with expectation. Acquittals and reduced sentences undermined authority publicly, reinforcing the impression that the system could not hold. Women read these outcomes as confirmation rather than warning. They understood that visibility carried risk, but also that the state's tools were blunt. The gap between suspicion and proof remained exploitable. They adjusted behavior to remain just within it. Alice Diamond absorbed much of this pressure. Her name appeared increasingly in internal discussions and public commentary. Surveillance around her tightened. Her movements were noted. Her associations scrutinized. This attention constrained her activity, but it also shielded others. Police focus narrowed where it should have widened. Alice managed this deliberately. She withdrew from some operations entirely, allowing others to proceed without her presence. She appeared selectively, accepting risk when deterrence or coordination required it. She knew that her arrest would be symbolically powerful, but operationally limited if the system beneath her remained intact. The state misread this calculus. It believed that pressure concentrated on a single figure could fracture the whole. It underestimated the degree to which leadership had already been distributed. Alice was a focal point, not a keystone. As pressure mounted, tension sharpened on all sides. Police worked longer hours with diminishing returns. Shopkeepers grew impatient with assurances that failed to stem losses. Assistants remained caught between instruction and fear. The women themselves operated under constant strain, balancing caution against necessity. This strain altered behavior incrementally. Mistakes crept in. Timing slipped. Interactions grew shorter, more brittle. The margin for error narrowed further. The system still held, but its resilience was being tested more severely than ever before. The state sensed vulnerability and pressed harder. Surveillance intensified again. Arrests increased marginally. The rhetoric of crackdown entered public discourse. Confidence was projected loudly, whether or not it was felt privately. What the state did not yet understand was that pressure alone could not dismantle what had taken decades to form. It could exhaust individuals. It could disrupt routines. It could generate spectacle. But without structural change, without addressing the assumptions that allowed the work to function, enforcement remained reactive. The women, for their part, understood that this phase could not last indefinitely. Something would give. Either attention would wane, as it had before, or a decisive blow would land. Preparation for both possibilities began quietly. Resources were conserved. Exposure was managed ruthlessly. The contest had reached a new stage. It was no longer about invisibility or intimidation. It was about endurance under sustained scrutiny, about which system could absorb pressure longer without collapsing. The city waited for resolution. It would not come easily. And when it did, it would not look like victory for anyone involved. Chapter 17. The trial was meant to be an ending. It behaved more like an exposure. By the time the case reached court, anticipation had outpaced evidence. The press framed the proceedings as a reckoning, the moment when persistence would finally be met with consequence. Police spoke carefully but confidently, hinting at connections they could not yet demonstrate. Shopkeepers waited for vindication. Readers waited for a story with a moral. What the court required was proof. The room itself encouraged simplification. Complex histories were compressed into charges read aloud. Years of adaptation were flattened into dates and items. The narrative presented to the bench was narrow by design, constrained by what could be substantiated without speculation. The system that had sustained the work for decades was reduced to the actions of individuals on specific days. The women understood this compression well. They sat quietly, expressions controlled, allowing others to project meaning onto them. Their clothing was chosen carefully, respectable without extravagance. Nothing invited interpretation beyond the charge itself. Performance here was not about deception, but about minimizing surface area for judgment. Witnesses struggled. Shop assistants recalled fear without being able to articulate it precisely. They described impressions rather than events, unease rather than action. Defense counsel seized on this ambiguity, reframing it as assumption. Memory faltered under questioning. Certainty dissolved. Police testimony fared little better. Officers described surveillance that had yielded suspicion rather than proof. Associations that suggested coordination could not be demonstrated conclusively. Patterns remained patterns, not evidence. The gap between what was believed and what could be shown widened under cross-examination. The press filled that gap eagerly. Court sketches exaggerated posture and expression. Headlines hinted at menace the testimony could not support. Language did the work evidence could not, constructing coherence from fragments. Readers were invited to see organization where the court could only see recurrence. Sentencing reflected this tension. Where convictions were secured, punishment was uneven. Some women received harsher sentences than expected, made examples in lieu of systemic response. Others walked free on technicalities, their release framed as failure rather than function of law. No outcome satisfied expectation. Inside the network, the trial's impact was immediate and unsentimental. Those sentenced were absorbed into prison routines with grim familiarity. Those released withdrew temporarily, understanding that visibility had peaked. Others adjusted roles to compensate. The work did not pause to mourn outcome. It redistributed. What the trial exposed most clearly was the limit of the state's approach. Targeting individuals had produced spectacle without resolution. The system beneath them remained intact, bruised but functional. Pressure had intensified, but clarity had not followed. The court could punish acts, not dismantle structures. For the women involved, this was confirmation rather than surprise. They had never believed that trials would end the work. They understood courts as moments of disruption, not closure. Survival depended on managing these moments, not avoiding them altogether. The public, however, reacted differently. Some readers were outraged by perceived leniency. Others expressed discomfort at the severity of sentences imposed on women whose crimes appeared nonviolent. The narrative fractured. Moral certainty wavered. The clarity promised by the trial proved elusive. Police leadership absorbed the outcome quietly. Official statements emphasized resolve. Internally, frustration deepened. Resources had been expended for limited return. The sense that something fundamental was being missed grew harder to ignore. The women returned to the city altered, but not undone. Those who had been at the center withdrew further. Those at the margins stepped forward cautiously. The balance shifted again, not back to invisibility, but away from confrontation. The system learned from exposure, as it always had. What lingered was the knowledge that attention could concentrate quickly, and that concentration carried cost. The next phase would not be about proving existence. That had been accomplished, if imperfectly. It would be about endurance after exposure, about whether a system built on adaptation could survive sustained public scrutiny. The trial had not ended the story. It had clarified the stakes. And those stakes were higher now than they had ever been. Chapter 18. Prison did not end anything. It rearranged it. For the women sentenced after the trial, incarceration was neither unfamiliar nor abstract. It was a return to a system they already understood, one with its own rhythms, hierarchies, and unspoken rules. What had changed was visibility. Their names now carried weight inside as well as outside. Recognition preceded them through the gates. Alice Diamond entered this space under intensified scrutiny. Warders knew her name. Other inmates knew her reputation. She did not need to assert herself overtly. Her presence alone shaped behavior. Some women sought proximity, hoping association might confer protection or status. Others kept their distance, wary of attention that could invite consequence. Alice navigated this carefully. She did not attempt to dominate the prison environment. That would have invited intervention. Instead, she maintained composure, enforced boundaries quietly, and avoided conflict that could escalate. Her authority remained situational, expressed through restraint rather than display. Information moved, as it always had. Women exchanged news in fragments, carried through work details, exercise yards, and shared meals. Arrests outside were noted. Shifts in police focus were inferred. The trial's outcomes were dissected without sentiment. Lessons were extracted. The system adapted once more. Those not imprisoned absorbed additional risk. Roles were redistributed. Operations slowed and tightened. Visibility was managed ruthlessly. The absence of central figures created space for others to step forward, though none attempted to replicate Alice's prominence. The lesson of concentrated attention had been learned too well. Police watched for collapse. It did not come. Instead, activity resumed at a lower, steadier frequency. Losses continued. Arrests remained sporadic. The sense of resolution promised by the trial faded quickly, replaced by the familiar frustration of persistence. Inside prison, time altered perspective. Days stretched. Routine dulled urgency. The immediate pressures of coordination fell away, replaced by endurance. Alice's focus narrowed to survival, reputation, and control of her own conduct. She avoided infractions. She preserved strength. She waited. This waiting was not passive. She paid attention. She observed how authority operated inside, how rules bent and where they did not. She learned which staff could be navigated and which could not. This knowledge mattered less for her own release than for what it represented: continuity of competence across environments. Release, when it came, was anticlimactic. There was no ceremony, no sense of return to former status. The city had moved on without waiting. Shops had changed layouts. Police attention had shifted. New names circulated in whispers. Alice re-entered a system that had adapted to her absence. Her influence persisted, but differently. She no longer dominated through presence. She influenced through memory, through standards she had imposed that continued to shape behavior. Women who had worked under her carried those expectations forward. Discipline outlived the disciplinarian. Not all welcomed her return. Some had grown accustomed to operating without a singular focal point. Others feared renewed scrutiny. Alliances were renegotiated cautiously. Alice understood this. She did not attempt to reclaim centrality immediately. She tested the ground. The press watched for resurgence. Stories speculated about her return, her intentions, her potential to reassert control. These narratives exaggerated both threat and coherence. The reality was quieter, more tentative. Visibility remained a liability. Police, too, watched closely. Surveillance resumed, though resources were thinner. The appetite for another spectacle was limited by recent disappointment. Officers tracked movements, noted associations, waited for missteps. The women responded by offering none. What emerged from this period was not decline, but transformation. The system that had once relied on visible deterrence and concentrated authority diffused further. Leadership became less personal, more procedural. Practices hardened into norms. Reputation circulated without embodiment. Alice's role shifted accordingly. She became less a commander than a reference point, invoked rather than encountered. Her history informed caution. Her methods informed discipline. Her presence, when it occurred, was restrained. This evolution frustrated attempts to narrate closure. The story the city wanted, a rise, a reckoning, a fall, refused to complete itself. The women involved did not dissolve into obscurity or repent publicly. They adapted, as they always had, to the new conditions imposed upon them. Prison had not broken the system. It had tested and refined it. The cost, however, was cumulative. Years lost. Bodies worn. Relationships strained beyond repair. Children grew without mothers present. The work endured, but it exacted payment that was not always visible in court records or newspaper columns. Alice carried that cost visibly. Age marked her more than prison had. The edge that had once unsettled others softened into caution. She remained formidable, but no longer inexhaustible. The city, which had treated her as symbol, did not notice this change. It preferred caricature. What lay ahead was not another dramatic confrontation, but erosion. The world that had produced the 40 elephants was changing. Retail practices evolved. Surveillance improved. Opportunities narrowed. The system would persist, but not indefinitely, and not unchanged. Alice Diamond's imprisonment marked neither beginning nor end. It marked transition. From dominance to diffusion. From spectacle to persistence. From a story that demanded attention to one that would fade unevenly, leaving traces rather than monuments. The women who had built and sustained this system would carry it forward for as long as conditions allowed. When those conditions shifted decisively, the work would not end in a single moment. It would thin. And thinning, unlike collapse, would be harder for anyone to see. Chapter 19. By the time the system had diffused enough to avoid easy detection, it had also become legible enough to be copied. Imitation did not come from admiration. It came from observation. Other women, watching the persistence of theft in shops that were increasingly hostile to amateurs, recognized that something more disciplined was at work. They noticed which methods endured, which behaviors provoked response, which names carried weight even when those names were absent. Some tried to replicate what they saw. These copycats rarely lasted long. They mistook technique for structure, boldness for authority. They rushed. They took too much. They relied on intimidation without understanding its restraint. Their arrests were swift and often humiliating, reinforcing the belief that what had worked for decades could not be reproduced casually. Others learned more carefully. They adopted fragments rather than wholes. They copied clothing modifications, timing preferences, exit strategies. They avoided explicit association with known figures. They operated quietly, testing limits incrementally. Some of these women folded into the existing network at its edges. Others remained parallel, tolerated so long as they did not attract unwanted attention. Rivalry emerged where boundaries blurred. Overlapping territories created tension, particularly when less disciplined operators drew scrutiny to shops that had previously absorbed losses quietly. Words were exchanged. Warnings delivered obliquely. In some cases, confrontation escalated briefly before receding. No one benefited from open conflict. The cost was too high. The reputation of the 40 elephants, by now firmly embedded in press and police language, functioned as both deterrent and umbrella. Women who invoked the name without connection found it carried less protection than they expected. Those who operated within its orbit understood its limits. Reputation could open doors or close them. It could intimidate staff or provoke surveillance. Managing it required judgment. Alice Diamond's name lingered longest. Even as her direct involvement diminished, references to her persisted in courtrooms, newspapers, and police briefings. She became shorthand for a type of threat rather than a specific actor. This abstraction distorted reality but shaped behavior nonetheless. Some women benefited from this distortion. Police attention focused on familiar names, allowing others to operate beneath the threshold of recognition. The press recycled narratives rather than uncovering new ones. The city chased ghosts while living systems adjusted quietly. This misalignment created space. Within it, the network continued to thin and adapt. Older women withdrew permanently. Younger ones entered cautiously. Methods evolved to accommodate changing retail environments. Smaller shops replaced larger targets. Quantity gave way to selectivity. Rival groups never fully displaced the original system. They lacked its depth, its memory, its patience. What they could copy were surfaces. What they could not reproduce was continuity. Decades of accumulated knowledge could not be rushed. The result was not competition in the traditional sense. It was stratification. Layers of activity operating at different levels of competence and visibility. Some rose briefly and fell. Others persisted quietly. The core system endured, diminished but intact. The state continued to respond unevenly. Police files accumulated names without context. Courts processed cases individually. The press repeated familiar tropes. None of these institutions adjusted fully to the reality that what they were confronting was no longer a single group or leader, but a practice embedded in social and economic conditions. As the years passed, the idea of the 40 elephants hardened into legend. The name detached from specific women and attached instead to a way of operating. It became a reference point rather than a description. New thefts were attributed to it reflexively, regardless of connection. The term lost precision and gained reach. This suited some and disadvantaged others. Women wrongly associated found themselves facing scrutiny they had not earned. Others used the ambiguity as cover. The myth did work the system itself no longer needed to perform. What was lost in this process was clarity. The public story became simpler as the reality grew more complex. The decline of visible figures was mistaken for resolution. The persistence of theft was dismissed as coincidence. The structural factors that had enabled the system were left unexamined. Inside the thinning network, this simplification was understood and exploited. Women adjusted to being underestimated again. They operated beneath legend, allowing outdated assumptions to guide enforcement. The work was quieter now, less dramatic, but still present. Alice Diamond receded further during this period. Her health, her age, and the weight of sustained scrutiny limited her involvement. She remained a reference point rather than an actor. Others carried forward what they had learned from her, not her style but her insistence on discipline. The system no longer required her presence to function. This was both its success and its vulnerability. Without figures to draw attention, it became harder to narrate, harder to confront, but also harder to sustain cohesion. Fragmentation increased. Standards varied. The work endured, but unevenly. The era of dominance had passed. What remained was residue, practices, habits, reputations that outlived the conditions that produced them. The 40 elephants were no longer a single entity, if they ever had been. They were a memory-shaping behavior, a cautionary tale told in shops and police stations, a name that lingered long after its originators had moved on or disappeared. The next phase would not be marked by confrontation or spectacle. It would be marked by quiet erosion, by changes so gradual they would be noticed only in retrospect. The work would continue, thinner each year, until one day it would be spoken of entirely in the past tense. Not because it had been defeated, but because the world around it had changed enough to make it unnecessary. Chapter 20. Fascination curdles faster than it fades. As the years passed and the stories lost their novelty, the tone of coverage shifted decisively. What had once been framed with a mixture of curiosity and alarm was recast as something uglier and more dismissive. The women were no longer clever or daring in print. They were tiresome, repetitive, a social problem that refused to resolve itself. The press grew impatient. Editors who had once indulged colorful description now reached for shorthand. Details were trimmed. Context vanished. The women were reduced to types, invoked as evidence of moral decline rather than as subjects worthy of examination. Their crimes were no longer surprising, their persistence was treated as proof of inherent deficiency. This change in tone mattered. It stripped the women of the strange power visibility had once given them. Reputation, once a tool, became a liability. Names printed again and again lost their deterrent force and gained a different kind of weight. Familiarity bred contempt rather than caution. Court reporting reflected this hardening. Proceedings were summarized briskly, without the earlier attention to demeanor or dress. Sentences were noted without commentary. The women became interchangeable in print, their individuality erased in favor of narrative efficiency. The system they had navigated so carefully disappeared entirely from view. Public sympathy, never abundant, evaporated. Women who appeared repeatedly before magistrates were framed as willfully incorrigible. Structural explanations were absent. Poverty was mentioned only to be dismissed. Gender, once a source of fascination, became grounds for condemnation. These women were no longer curiosities, they were irritants. This condemnation did not increase enforcement. It changed expectations. Shopkeepers, reading the same coverage, felt less fear and more fatigue. Losses were still frustrating, but they were no longer personalized. Staff turnover diluted memory. The emotional charge that had once sharpened encounters softened into routine annoyance. Police responded in kind. Resources were directed elsewhere. The absence of dramatic headlines reduced pressure. The sense that the problem had peaked and passed, whether accurate or not, took hold. Surveillance loosened. Familiar names still appeared, but without urgency. For the women still operating, this shift was double-edged. Reduced scrutiny created space, but diminished reputation removed leverage. Intimidation lost potency when stories no longer circulated with force. Shops challenged more readily. Staff were less inclined to defer. The work adjusted again. Operations became smaller, quieter, more opportunistic. The emphasis shifted away from intimidation and toward avoidance. The system adapted to lower yield rather than higher risk. Longevity remained the aim, but the conditions that had once supported scale no longer existed. Alice Diamond's name appeared less often now, and when it did, it was stripped of grandeur. She was mentioned as a known quantity, an old offender, a figure from an earlier phase. The mythology that had once surrounded her flattened into footnote. This erasure was not deliberate, it was a function of impatience. The press had moved on. Other threats demanded attention. Other moral panics rose. Female thieves no longer symbolized disorder in the same way. The city's anxieties shifted elsewhere, leaving this story without oxygen. What remained was residue. Occasional articles invoked the 40 elephants as shorthand, usually inaccurately, attaching the name to thefts that bore little resemblance to the original system. The term became lazy, stripped of meaning, useful only for evoking a past menace that no longer required understanding. This simplification distorted memory. The women who had built and sustained the system disappeared from public consciousness not with dignity, but with neglect. Their lives continued, often difficult, often shortened, rarely recorded. When they died, it passed unnoticed. Inside the thinning network, this disappearance was recognized as both relief and loss. Anonymity returned, but without the protections reputation had once provided. The work could continue only at the margins. What had once been coordinated fractured into individual survival strategies again. The system that had thrived on attention and adaptation found itself in a world that no longer cared enough to resist it properly. That indifference was decisive. Without pressure to sharpen against, without fascination to exploit, the practices that had sustained the 40 elephants lost coherence. Skills remained. Knowledge persisted. But the collective identity dissolved. The press, in turning away, completed what enforcement had never achieved. Not an ending, exactly, but a dispersal. The story did not conclude with a final trial or decisive victory. It thinned into obscurity, absorbed back into the city's background noise. The women who had once unsettled assumptions about crime and gender were reduced to lines in old papers, their significance obscured by repetition. What condemnation accomplished, fascination never could. It removed the story from relevance. And in doing so, it ensured that what had once been feared would be remembered only dimly, as something that belonged to a different city, a different time, and a problem that had somehow solved itself. It had not. It had simply been forgotten. Chapter 21. The city did not defeat the system by force. It outgrew it. Retail changed first, not dramatically, but deliberately. Losses that had once been absorbed as nuisance were reclassified as inefficiency. New management philosophies arrived with spreadsheets and diagrams rather than moral language. Shrinkage became measurable. Prevention became procedural. Shops altered themselves from the inside out. Counters were repositioned to limit blind spots. Displays were redesigned to discourage handling. Items once laid open were tethered, boxed, or moved behind glass. Staff roles became more specialized, less flexible, more supervised. The freedom of movement that had once made theft invisible narrowed quietly. Training followed architecture. Assistants were instructed in scripts rather than discretion. Intervention was standardized. Suspicion was formalized. The personal judgment that had once been exploited was replaced by policy that left less room for hesitation. What had relied on social cues now relied on procedure. These changes were not responses to any single group. They reflected broader shifts in commerce, the rise of chain stores, centralized management, and uniform practice across districts. Local familiarity gave way to corporate anonymity. The relationship between staff and space altered fundamentally. For women accustomed to reading individual assistants, this mattered. It was no longer enough to assess a person. One had to assess a system. That system was less responsive to intimidation and less prone to embarrassment. It could escalate without fear of losing face. Surveillance improved alongside structure. Mirrors became standard. Lighting brightened. Layouts flattened. Security staff appeared more consistently, their presence normalized rather than exceptional. The quiet assumptions that had once allowed women to move freely eroded. The street changed too. Transport expanded. Neighborhoods shifted. Populations moved. The informal geographies that had supported recognition and discretion fragmented. Familiar routes dissolved under redevelopment. Markets closed or relocated. Lodging houses disappeared. Elephant and Castle itself transformed. Roads were reworked. Buildings demolished and rebuilt. The dense, transitory community that had once offered anonymity without isolation thinned. The district remained busy, but its character altered. The old networks of recognition weakened. Policing adapted unevenly but persistently. Records centralized. Information traveled more reliably. Repeat offenders were identified faster. The margin between suspicion and proof narrowed incrementally. While enforcement still struggled with coordination, the environment itself became less forgiving. The women who remained felt this shift acutely. What had once been a navigable landscape became resistant. Techniques still worked, but less often. Risk increased while reward diminished. The calculations that had once favored continuity no longer balanced. Some adapted again. They shifted focus to smaller targets, quieter spaces, different goods. They worked alone rather than in groups. They relied on speed rather than discipline. These adaptations preserved activity but sacrificed stability. Others stopped. Age, exhaustion, and diminishing returns converged. The work had always demanded attention and nerve. As opportunity narrowed, the cost outweighed the benefit. Women withdrew quietly, folding back into legitimate labor, family dependence, or obscurity. No announcement marked this retreat. There was no final operation, no decisive failure. The system thinned until it could no longer sustain itself as a collective practice. What remained were individuals applying fragments of old knowledge in new contexts. The 40 Elephants did not end as an organization because they had never been one in the formal sense. They ended as a moment. A convergence of social assumptions, retail design, gendered blindness, and economic necessity that no longer aligned. When those conditions shifted, the practices they had enabled lost coherence. This did not mean theft vanished. It persisted, as it always had, adapted to new forms and environments. What disappeared was the particular configuration that had allowed women to operate collectively, visibly, and effectively for so long. The city learned without acknowledging the lesson. It credited enforcement rather than environment. It praised toughness rather than design. It remembered personalities rather than systems. In doing so, it missed what had actually changed. For the women who had lived through this era, the ending was quieter. Some carried pride privately. Others carried regret. Most carried neither, only the weight of years spent navigating a city that had rarely offered them security by legitimate means. Their knowledge became obsolete not because it was flawed, but because the world it belonged to had moved on. Windows still existed. Goods were still displayed. Desire still circulated. But the assumptions that had once made daylight theft possible had been revised. The city no longer trusted appearances. In closing that gap, it closed a chapter of its own history, one it would later struggle to remember clearly. The 40 elephants faded not with a fall, but with a rearrangement of space, attention, and expectation. And like many systems shaped by necessity rather than ideology, they disappeared without ceremony, leaving behind traces that only made sense once the conditions that produced them were understood. Chapter 22. What happened to them is harder to say than what they did. The historical record grows thin precisely where curiosity might expect it to thicken. Court appearances end. Prison registers close. Addresses stop changing because they stop being recorded at all. The women who had once appeared so frequently in print recede into anonymity without ceremony, not because they were redeemed or destroyed, but because the systems that tracked them lost interest. Some married. Names changed, sometimes more than once. A woman who had been known to police under half a dozen aliases might vanish entirely into a married name that never appeared in a charge sheet. Respectability, once a costume, became a shield. Children arrived. Domestic routines replaced street rhythms. What had once been agility hardened into habit. Others did not. Some women remained single, living with relatives or alone, working intermittently, relying on informal economies that left little trace. Cleaning, laundry, caretaking, factory work when available. These lives were not dramatic enough to attract record, but they were not easy either. Illness appears often in the margins. Prison had taken its toll. So had years of physical strain, poor nutrition, stress, and violence that was rarely documented unless it spilled into court. Women died young of causes described vaguely: decline, consumption, weakness. These words obscured more than they explained. A few returned to prison repeatedly. Their names reappeared briefly in later decades, stripped of context, described as habitual offenders without history. What they had once been part of was invisible to the system processing them. They were treated as anomalies rather than remnants of a vanished configuration. Alice Diamond's later years resist neat summary. She did not die dramatically. She did not vanish entirely. She lived on, older, poorer, less formidable than the figure newspapers had once constructed. Her reputation outlasted her capacity to act. When her name appeared, it did so as echo rather than event. There was no reckoning, no moment of reflection offered by the institutions that had once obsessed over her. The women who had worked alongside her fared similarly. Their lives diverged quietly. Some found stability. Others did not. Few left written testimony. Those who might have spoken had little incentive to do so. Silence had served them well for decades. There was no reward for breaking it late. What survives instead are absences. Gaps where correspondence might have been. Years without entries. Lives reduced to beginnings and interruptions, with no sanctioned endings. The historian is left with fragments and inference, patterns without closure. This absence is not accidental. Working-class women were rarely afforded full narratives. Their lives were recorded when they intersected with authority and ignored when they did not. Crime generated documentation. Survival did not. Once the women ceased to be useful as warnings or spectacles, they ceased to be recorded. This erasure shapes how the story is remembered. It encourages the belief that the 40 elephants ended decisively, that women reformed or were removed. In reality, they aged. They adapted. They endured. Their lives continued in forms that did not interest institutions designed to notice disruption rather than persistence. The difficulty of tracing them is itself evidence. It speaks to how completely these women had learned to navigate invisibility when it suited them. It also reflects how quickly attention moves on once a problem ceases to demand solution. What remains are glimpses. A death notice. A census entry. A marriage certificate. These documents do not explain the years between, nor the skills that once sustained survival. They offer legitimacy without context, respectability without history. For some, that may have been the point. The end of the 40 elephants as a collective practice did not require acknowledgement from those who had lived it. They had never sought recognition on those terms. Their success had always depended on misdirection, on being seen as something other than what they were. In disappearing from the record, they completed that strategy. The city, meanwhile, moved on. New anxieties replaced old ones. New forms of crime emerged, demanding new responses. The conditions that had made the 40 elephants possible were remembered only vaguely, if at all. When their name surfaced, it did so as legend, detached from the lives that had sustained it. What is lost in this detachment is not drama, but understanding. The women did not vanish because they failed. They vanished because the moment that required them passed, and because history rarely follows those who return quietly to obscurity. Their afterlives resist narrative because they resist spectacle. They are ordinary in ways that rarely interest archives, yet extraordinary in what they suggest about survival under constraint. If there is an ending here, it is not located in a final act, but in dispersal. Lives continued without witnesses. And that, perhaps more than any sentence passed in court, marks the true conclusion of their story. Chapter 23. The last elephants did not know they were last. They worked without the sense of inheritance that had shaped earlier decades, without the weight of continuity that once bound individuals into something recognizable. What remained of the system by this point was fragmented, carried forward by habit rather than intention. Women stole because it still worked sometimes, because they still needed to, because knowledge once learned did not evaporate simply because the world around it had shifted. But the conditions were no longer generous. Arrests in these later years were smaller, quieter, stripped of drama. Names surfaced briefly in court columns and vanished again without follow-up. The charges were familiar, the sentences unremarkable. There were no grand claims of conspiracy, no breathless speculation. The system that had once struggled to name what it was confronting now processed these cases with weary efficiency. Police officers who encountered these women rarely connected them to a longer story. Files had been closed, lost, or rendered irrelevant by institutional change. The names meant little to those who had not lived through earlier phases. When older officers recognized patterns, there was rarely incentive to pursue them. The work had thinned too far to justify sustained attention. These women operated alone or in pairs. Coordination, where it existed, was fleeting and pragmatic. A shared tip. A brief collaboration. Nothing that could withstand pressure or survive interruption. The collective discipline that had once absorbed arrests and redistributed labor was gone. What remained was skill without infrastructure. Some women were remarkably competent, their movements smooth, their timing precise, their instincts still sharp. Others were careless, misjudging a world that no longer bent easily. Arrests often came swiftly for the latter. For the former, success was intermittent and precarious. The shops they worked in barely resembled those of earlier decades. Layouts were rigid. Staff were trained to intervene without hesitation. Surveillance was assumed rather than exceptional. The freedom of movement that had once enabled daylight theft had narrowed to corridors and corners. Opportunities still existed, but they were brittle. Fear no longer functioned as it once had. Staff did not recognize names. Reputation carried little weight. Intimidation, when attempted, often backfired, provoking escalation rather than retreat. The emotional economy of the shop floor had shifted decisively. The women adapted as best they could. They relied on speed, on opportunism, on moments of human distraction rather than structural blindness. Theft became riskier, less predictable, more exhausting. The margin that had once sustained livelihoods shrank to something barely workable. Many stopped not because they were caught, but because it no longer paid. Age made itself felt more acutely under these conditions. Bodies that had once absorbed long days on foot and quick movement between spaces slowed. Reflexes dulled. Recovery took longer. The work demanded more than it returned. Some women were arrested repeatedly in quick succession, their inability to adapt marking the end of their involvement. These arrests were processed without comment. Magistrates noted prior convictions without context. Sentences followed routine. No one remarked on the closing of a chapter. Others managed to withdraw before that point. They took whatever exit was available: informal work, family dependence, migration, illness. These withdrawals were rarely recorded. They left no trace beyond absence. What is striking, in retrospect, is how little resistance accompanied this ending. There were no final attempts to reassert dominance, no dramatic confrontations with authority. The system did not fight for survival. It simply ceased to function as conditions made its continuation untenable. The 40 elephants did not collapse. They dispersed. What survived were habits embedded in individuals rather than structures. A way of reading a room. A way of moving through space. A reflexive awareness of where attention lay. These skills lingered, occasionally reactivated, but no longer sustained by shared understanding. For the city, this dispersal passed largely unnoticed. There was no announcement of victory. No acknowledgement that something had ended. The absence of spectacle meant the absence of memory. What had once unsettled assumptions about crime and gender faded into the background noise of everyday policing. Only in hindsight does the pattern become visible. The last arrests cluster sparsely. The final references thin out. The name appears less frequently, then not at all. The 40 elephants become something that once existed, then something that might have existed, then something people half remember hearing about. The women who carried this final phase did so without recognition. They were not queens or leaders. They were not mythic figures. They were individuals applying knowledge learned in a different world to conditions that no longer supported it. Their failure was structural, not personal. In this sense, they represent the truest ending of the story. Not the rise or fall of a singular figure, not the spectacle of trial or condemnation, but the quiet exhaustion of a practice that had outlived its moment. When the last elephant stepped out of a shop and did not return, no one marked the occasion. There was no audience. There was only a city that had changed enough to make her unnecessary, and a woman who understood, perhaps without articulating it, that the work she had inherited no longer belonged to the world she was standing in. The story did not end because it was defeated. It ended because it no longer fit. Chapter 24. Where did they go is the wrong question. The better question is why the record stops asking. After the last clusters of arrests fade from the papers, the women do not vanish so much as slip beyond the boundaries of attention. Their disappearance is administrative rather than dramatic. Files close. Clerks stop copying names. Reporters move on. The machinery that once produced detail grinds quietly into disinterest. This is how most lives leave history. For decades, these women existed in the record because they were useful to it. They illustrated moral arguments. They filled columns. They justified budgets and speeches. When they ceased to perform those functions, the record released them without ceremony. The gaps that follow are not random. They cluster around precisely the moments when life becomes ordinary again. Marriage. Illness. Work that does not attract oversight. Caregiving. Migration. These transitions are poorly documented for working-class women, even in the best of circumstances. For women who had spent years avoiding notice, they are almost impossible to trace. What survives instead are fragments. A census entry that lists an occupation without explanation. A marriage certificate that replaces one name with another. A death record that reduces a life to date and cause. These documents do not contradict the earlier record, but they do not explain it either. They sit beside it, refusing narrative connection. Historians are trained to distrust silence. Yet silence is not always the absence of information. Sometimes it is the result of successful adaptation. The women who had spent years navigating systems of surveillance understood how to pass beyond them when necessary. They knew which interactions generated paperwork and which did not. They knew how to live in ways that did not invite record. In this sense, disappearance was not failure. It was completion. The skills that had once sustained theft, attention, restraint, misdirection, translated effectively into survival outside the gaze of authority. A woman who could manage police scrutiny could manage a census enumerator. A woman who could navigate prison routines could navigate bureaucratic indifference. This does not mean their later lives were easy. Absence from the record does not imply comfort or stability. It implies only that hardship took forms that institutions did not prioritize. Poverty endured. Health declined. Dependence shifted from informal networks to family or charity. These struggles were real, but they were not narratively useful. The temptation, when confronted with these gaps, is to fill them. To imagine redemption or ruin. To assign moral arcs that satisfy expectation. This book resists that impulse deliberately. The absence of evidence is not permission to invent. It is a historical fact in its own right. What can be said is limited, but meaningful. These women did not disappear because they were erased by force. They disappeared because the world they had adapted to changed, and they adapted again. They did not leave behind memoirs or manifestos because silence had always been safer than explanation. The record's failure to follow them is not neutral. It reflects whose lives were considered worth tracking, whose suffering demanded attention, whose survival counted as achievement. The women of the 40 elephants mattered intensely to institutions when they disrupted order. They mattered not at all when they ceased to do so. This asymmetry shapes memory. It encourages stories that end with punishment or decline, because those are the moments that leave traces. It obscures the long middles and quiet ends where most lives actually unfold. To ask where they went is to assume there is an answer proportional to the question. Often there is not. What remains is pattern rather than biography, movement rather than destination. The knowledge that lives continued beyond the frame, altered but not annihilated. In accepting this, the story reaches a different kind of conclusion. Not one of resolution, but of recognition. The 40 elephants cannot be followed all the way to the end because the systems that once made them visible stopped looking. That fact tells us as much about those systems as it does about the women themselves. History, like policing, notices disruption more readily than endurance. The women knew this. They lived accordingly. And in doing so, they ensured that the final act of their story would not belong to the court, the prison, or the press, but to the quiet, unremarkable continuation of life beyond the reach of record. That is not a failure of narrative. It is its most honest boundary. Chapter 25. The 40 elephants matter not because they were exceptional criminals, but because they were ordinary women who discovered how much could be done inside a system that did not expect them to act at all. Their story is often reduced to novelty. A women's gang. Female shoplifters. An oddity to be marveled at briefly before being dismissed. This framing is comforting. It allows the reader to see the 40 elephants as an anomaly rather than a product. It preserves the idea that the social order functioned as intended, with only the occasional aberration. The record does not support that comfort. What sustained the 40 elephants for decades was not daring, nor cruelty, nor even organization in the conventional sense. It was alignment. Economic necessity aligned with retail design. Gendered assumptions aligned with visibility. Policing priorities aligned with institutional blind spots. When those conditions converged, the result was not chaos, but a workable system. This is what makes their story unsettling. They did not need to overthrow the rules. They learned them. They did not need secrecy. They used openness. They did not need invisibility. They learned when visibility protected them more effectively than darkness ever could. In this sense, the 40 elephants reveal less about criminality than about structure. They show how systems create their own vulnerabilities, how assumptions about who is dangerous shape what is protected, and how social roles can be exploited by those who are forced to perform them daily. Respectability, for these women, was not a moral state. It was a tool. The question that lingers is not why they stole, but why it worked for so long. The answer lies in the fact that the city was not built to see them clearly. Women were expected to browse, not to organize, to desire, not to act, to be passive consumers rather than strategic participants. These expectations shaped shops, policing, and press coverage alike. The 40 elephants exploited that shaping without needing to articulate it. They did not theorize their advantage. They practiced it. They refined it collectively, through repetition and consequence, until it became habit. Their success was not ideological. It was empirical. This matters because it challenges familiar narratives of crime and punishment. The state did not fail because it was weak. It failed because it was rigid. It applied tools designed for different threats to a problem that did not conform to them. When those tools produced spectacle rather than resolution, the response was to apply them harder rather than differently. Only when the environment itself changed did the problem recede. This is a lesson institutions rarely enjoy acknowledging. The 40 elephants were not defeated by better policing alone. They were outgrown by redesigned spaces, altered retail practices, shifting labor markets, and centralized systems that reduced reliance on individual judgment. Once those changes took hold, the practices that had sustained the women lost coherence. That shift is often misremembered as victory. It was not. It was adaptation on a scale larger than any one group could resist. The same forces that closed gaps for the 40 elephants opened new ones elsewhere, for different forms of crime, carried out by different actors under different assumptions. To treat their story as cautionary rather than instructive is to miss its value. The 40 elephants matter because they force us to consider how crime emerges not only from individual intent, but from collective design. They demonstrate how marginalized people can develop sophisticated strategies within constraints, and how those strategies can persist long enough to feel natural. They also matter because they complicate narratives about women and agency. These women were neither passive victims nor romantic rebels. They were pragmatic actors responding to limited options. Their actions harmed others, sometimes seriously. That harm is not erased by explanation. But explanation does not excuse harm any more than condemnation explains it. What their story offers instead is clarity. It shows how autonomy can be carved out of restriction, how power can be exercised quietly, and how systems that deny agency often create the conditions for its most unexpected expressions. The 40 elephants were not heroes. They were not monsters. They were women who learned how to survive in a city that offered them little protection and less patience. If their story unsettles, it should. Not because it celebrates crime, but because it reveals how much of what we call order depends on assumption, and how fragile those assumptions become when they are learned too well by those they were meant to constrain. This is why the 40 elephants endure as more than a curiosity. They are a case study in alignment between social expectation and opportunity, in how long a system can function when its vulnerabilities are mistaken for permanence. Their story does not ask for admiration. It asks for attention. And attention, as the city itself eventually learned, is always the most difficult thing to manage. Chapter 26. Myth is what fills the space where certainty thins. The 40 elephants have survived not because their history is well preserved, but because it is incomplete. The gaps invite invention. Over time, repetition hardens speculation into fact, and fact into legend. What begins as a journalistic shorthand becomes a story told without reference to record. This process has not been neutral. The myth of the 40 elephants exaggerates what was already visible and erases what was not. It inflates violence while diminishing patience. It centers personalities at the expense of systems. It prefers singular brilliance to collective practice, because brilliance is easier to narrate. Alice Diamond, in particular, has been burdened by this transformation. She is remembered as a kind of criminal monarch, a woman whose authority derived from physical dominance and fear alone. This version of Alice is satisfying in its clarity and misleading in its emphasis. It strips her of context and replaces structure with temperament. It turns adaptation into charisma. The record does not support this simplification. What emerges from court transcripts, police reports, and contemporary journalism is not a singular mastermind but a figure who occupied a moment when attention required focus. Alice mattered not because she invented the system, but because she could carry its weight. Her power was real, but it was not solitary. The myth also exaggerates cohesion. Later accounts often describe the 40 elephants as a tightly organized gang with fixed membership, territory, and command. This image borrows from male criminal archetypes that feel familiar and reassuring. The reality was looser, more adaptive, and more difficult to dismantle precisely because it resisted formalization. This misunderstanding has consequences. When history is flattened into legend, it obscures how and why things worked. It encourages the belief that removing a leader solves a problem, that disruption is synonymous with resolution. It overlooks the environmental conditions that made the system viable in the first place. At the same time, dismissal does its own damage. To wave the story away as exaggerated or trivial is to ignore the persistence documented across decades. It denies the seriousness of the harm caused, the ingenuity involved, and the institutional failures revealed. It reduces the women to caricatures twice over, first as monsters, then as jokes. Between myth and dismissal lies the record. The record is imperfect, biased, and incomplete. It privileges moments of disruption over long stretches of survival. It reflects the priorities of institutions rather than the experiences of those navigating them. But it is what remains, and it must be handled carefully. This book has relied on it without surrendering to it. Where evidence exists, it has been followed. Where it does not, silence has been preserved rather than filled. Reconstruction has been constrained by pattern rather than imagination. This discipline is not academic fastidiousness. It is ethical necessity. The temptation to tidy the story is strong. Readers expect arcs. They look for beginnings and endings, heroes and villains, causes and effects. The 40 Elephants resist this structure because their story unfolded within systems that rarely produce neat outcomes. Their rise was gradual. Their decline was diffuse. Their impact was uneven. To impose clarity where none existed is to misrepresent what they reveal. The myth of the 40 Elephants endures partly because it flatters authority. It suggests that the problem was known, named, and addressed, even if belatedly. It frames persistence as defiance rather than alignment. It reassures us that order reasserted itself through will rather than redesign. The record suggests otherwise. What ended the 40 Elephants was not mythic confrontation, but structural change. The legend distracts from that reality, encouraging future institutions to repeat the same mistakes under different names. Separating myth from record does not diminish the story. It sharpens it. It allows us to see how gendered assumptions operated in practice, how visibility could function as cover, how informal coordination could outperform formal hierarchy, and how systems adapt slowly even when confronted repeatedly with their own limitations. This clarity matters beyond this case. The 40 Elephants are not unique because they were women. They are instructive because they reveal how marginalized groups can exploit expectations placed upon them, and how long such exploitation can persist when those expectations are embedded in design rather than policy. The legend, with its emphasis on spectacle, conceals that lesson. The record, with all its gaps and biases, makes it visible. To read this story responsibly is to hold both in view without surrendering to either. To resist the satisfaction of myth and the comfort of dismissal. To accept complexity without demanding resolution. In doing so, the 40 Elephants emerge not as characters in a fable, but as participants in a historical process that continues to repeat itself under new guises. Their story survives not because it is extraordinary, but because it is structurally familiar. That familiarity, more than any ring or nickname, is what deserves to be remembered. Chapter 27. History did not know what to do with these women. It knew how to arrest them, sentence them, and describe them in language calibrated for warning rather than understanding. It knew how to turn them into symbols when that proved useful. What it did not know how to do was account for them once they exceeded the categories available. Working-class women were expected to be legible in only a handful of ways. As daughters, wives, mothers, victims, or cautionary examples. When they acted outside those frames, the record responded by flattening them into something manageable. Criminal. Deviant. Incorrigible. The 40 Elephants were intelligible to institutions only insofar as they could be reduced to those terms. This reduction did not explain them. It obscured the fact that these women were planners, negotiators, risk managers, caregivers, and survivors, often simultaneously. It concealed the complexity of lives lived under constraint, where moral choice was rarely clean and agency was exercised in narrow, contested spaces. The discomfort their story generates comes from this mismatch. The women were not powerless enough to be pitted comfortably, nor powerful enough to be condemned as singular threats. They operated collectively without ideology, strategically without rhetoric, persistently without visibility. They did not fit the available narratives. So history tried to make them fit. When they were visible, they were exaggerated. When they were no longer useful, they were ignored. Their story was either too much or nothing at all. There was little room for accuracy in between. This is not unique to the 40 Elephants. It is a pattern that repeats wherever marginalized people demonstrate competence in ways that unsettle assumption. When survival requires intelligence and coordination, but recognition is denied, history struggles to respond honestly. What survives instead are distortions. The 40 Elephants become either folklore or footnote, a curiosity to be mentioned briefly, or a menace to be invoked vaguely. Both treatments avoid the harder work of understanding how ordinary systems can produce extraordinary persistence when left unexamined. The women themselves did not ask to be remembered. They did not seek legacy. They did not leave manifestos or reflections. Their priority was continuity, feeding children, paying rent, avoiding the worst consequences of a city that offered little forgiveness. That they succeeded for as long as they did is notable not because it was criminal, but because it was adaptive. History prefers intention to adaptation. It is more comfortable with declared rebellion than with quiet recalibration. The 40 Elephants offer no grand statements, no coherent ideology to analyze. Their meaning must be inferred from practice rather than proclamation. This makes them difficult subjects. They demand attention to systems rather than personalities, to environment rather than morality. They ask us to consider how much of what we call order depends on who is expected to act, and who is not. The women history did not know what to do with are often those who reveal its limits most clearly. They show where categories fail, where assumptions crack, where design outruns policy. They expose the gap between how society imagines behavior and how behavior actually unfolds under pressure. The 40 Elephants lived in that gap. They did not create it, but they learned to move within it with remarkable consistency. When it closed, they moved on. They left behind no institution to commemorate them, no lineage to claim inheritance. Only traces, scattered and partial, that require patience to assemble. In telling this story, the aim has not been to redeem or condemn. It has been to restore proportion. To situate the women within the conditions that shaped them, without dissolving responsibility into inevitability or inflating agency into myth. To recognize harm without denying ingenuity. To acknowledge survival without romanticizing it. If the 40 Elephants resist closure, it is because their story does not resolve into lesson or warning neatly. It ends where most lives do, in dispersal, obscurity, and the slow erosion of record. What remains is not a moral, but a question. How many other systems have functioned for decades simply because no one expected them to exist? How many forms of competence remain illegible because they do not announce themselves in sanctioned ways? The 40 Elephants do not answer these questions. They make them unavoidable. And in that sense, they matter not as legends or curiosities, but as evidence of how much can happen in plain sight, and how easily it can pass out of memory once the conditions that made it visible are rearranged. That is where their story belongs. Not in myth, not in dismissal, but in the uneasy space between, where history is forced to reckon with what it has learned to overlook. Epilogue. If you walk through London now, you will not find them. The streets they moved through still exist, but they do not behave the same way. Shops no longer invite wandering hands with the same confidence. Windows are brighter, flatter, watched. Staff are trained to follow procedure rather than instinct. Movement is channeled. Attention is constant. Elephant and Castle remains a place of passage, but not of congregation. Roads cut differently. Buildings rise and vanish. The density that once allowed anonymity without isolation has been thinned and rearranged. The city has learned to manage bodies more efficiently. Nothing here announces what once happened. There are no plaques, no markers, no acknowledgement that for decades, women walked these pavements and quietly unsettled the assumptions that shaped them. The absence feels deliberate, even if it is not. The 40 Elephants survive instead in fragments. In old court columns, yellowed with age. In police files rarely revisited. In the shorthand of crime writing that inflates and distorts. In the occasional reference passed between historians with a mixture of fascination and frustration. And in the systems that replaced them. Every mirror placed to eliminate a blind spot. Every policy that removes discretion from staff. Every design choice that assumes a customer may act strategically rather than passively. These are not monuments, but they are inheritances. The city adapted without naming what it had adapted to. That is often how power responds to disruption it does not wish to understand. It alters conditions quietly, allowing the story to fade while the lesson remains embedded in structure. The women themselves did not linger. They aged. They worked. They cared for others. They died. Their lives were not redeemed by obscurity, nor defined by what they had once done. They were lived in the margins, where most lives take place. To stand in these streets now is to stand in a city that believes it is safer because it is wiser. Perhaps it is. But the story of the 40 Elephants suggests a different caution. Systems that rely on assumption rather than examination are always vulnerable to those who learn them too well. Blind spots do not disappear, they migrate. If the women of this story have been forgotten, it is not because they were unimportant. It is because they expose something uncomfortable about how order functions, and because forgetting is often easier than reckoning. Their story does not ask to be revived as legend. It asks to be remembered as process, as evidence that what appears stable is often provisional, and that agency does not always look like resistance. Sometimes it looks like learning the rules so thoroughly that they begin to work in unintended ways. The 40 elephants walked through shop doors in broad daylight, took what the city insisted was protected, and left behind a lesson the city quietly absorbed. The windows are different now, but they are still windows. And someone somewhere is already learning how they work.